Hey everyone, welcome back. If possible, you can support me via PayPal or become a channel member to help me keep this channel running. Thank you. Now let's get back to the story of Sword of Coming audio series. Chapter 961. Sword across the knees, looking around dazed. At Skeleton Shoalswood Garment Mountain, Pang Lanqi persuaded his grandfather to pick up his calligraphy brush again and draw a few extra sets of Celestial Maiden murals. He could gift these to other people, and this would be a good reason for him to travel to other continents in the future. In Malicious Ghost Valley, a small rat spirit sat on the steps outside Sheep Intestine Palace every day, basking in the sun with a long wooden spear resting on his knees. He would diligently guard the gates when his old ancestor was at home. When his old ancestor wasn't home, however, he would secretly retrieve the books and carefully flip through them. Inside Skeleton Wall City, Gao Cheng frequently felt uneasy during recent times, yet he couldn't figure out what was amiss. At Mute Lake, that kind-hearted water monster was no longer present, and it was said that she had embarked on a distant journey with some young cultivator. Over at the Golden Crow Palace, Lu Jiqing, the Golden Core Tier Sword cultivator with the highest seniority, was still sitting atop his mountain, unmoving. After sealing the mountain and entering seclusion, Lu Jiqing watched the myriad forms of life and emotions with a cold gaze, using the human heart to cleanse his sword. A shopkeeper had been hired for the small shop located on the Spring Dew Gardens Old Locust Street, and the shop aimed to make continuous profits over a long period of time. However, it was a shame that there were relatively few gullible customers nowadays. This was a slight blemish. The young shop attendant who used rocks from luminous jade cliff to carve seals and other study table curios was becoming increasingly deft with the carving knife, allowing him to earn money in a conscionable manner. After arriving at the Great Emblem Sword sect, Lu Jinglong was now cultivating in seclusion and breaking through to the next tier. It was said that two people were already waiting to challenge him with the sword after he succeeded. Duckweed Sword Lakes Li Kai and Dong Zhu. At the Sacred Lotus Nation's Peach Blossom Ferry Station, Lu Guibao was studying that Taoist scripture, occasionally recalling the foreign scholar called Huai Qian. While grumbling about her own lack of judgment skills, a slight hint of sadness also lingered in her heart, easily waved away, yet always finding its way back. Cloudtop City's Su Xingzhou had successfully advanced to the sea observation tier, and he was planning to bring a good amount of fine wine to visit Mr. Lu after he advanced to the upper 5 tiers and successfully withstood the challenges from the 3 sword immortals. Su Xingzhou had looked up to this young sword immortal for a long time already, and he had recently learned that Mr. Lu was actually very fond of drinking wine. He was simply unwilling to drink wine during normal times. With this in mind, Su Xingzhou had especially trained his own tolerance for wine, causing both Shen Zhanze and Zhao Qingwan to feel slightly worried. They were taken aback by his excessive drinking, speculating whether he was becoming too conceited for his own good. Su Xingzhou had no option but to explain the situation, revealing Mr. Chen's comment about his tolerance for wine being too poor. If he didn't address this shortcoming, he wouldn't have anything to talk about even if he managed to gain an audience with Mr. Lu. He most definitely wouldn't be able to drink with Mr. Lu either. Outside a thatched cottage atop a mountain peak of the Great Emblem Sword sect, Bai Shou, who had already become an official disciple of the sect, was sitting by himself on a long bench, rocking back and forth in boredom. Alrighty then. That person with the surname Lu was an extremely renowned sword immortal, so Bai Shou had initially thought that he would at least own a magnificent residence with an impressive immortal aura at the Great Emblem Sword sect. Unexpectedly, however, there was only the small and crappy cottage behind him. There were many books inside, but unfortunately Bai Shou didn't like to read, and thus Bai Shou started to ponder in his boredom that if he were still an assassin of Deer Cutter Mountain, could he possibly rival those few prodigies of the Great Emblem Sword sect? However, those cultivators who were the same age as him were all very polite, so he naturally couldn't reciprocate their smiles with violence. Bai Shou felt like he genuinely couldn't bring himself to attack them. After all, the gazes of those cultivators were filled with envy as they looked at him. Bai Shou found this incredibly strange. Were these cultivators that fond of becoming Lu Jinglong's disciple? Did they want to swap positions with him? However, it was a shame that they would look at him with strange expressions when he proposed this. Afterward, they would no longer wander around the thatched cottage. This worked for Bai Shou as well. It was far more peaceful with just himself. On the western shore of the northern complete reed continent, two Taoist priests, one old and one young, appeared near Infant Mountain's lightning god manor. The young Taoist priest squatted down and vomited uncontrollably. This was the good thing about having a wealth of experience. He had eaten and drunk his fill first, and vomiting something physical was a lot better than retching for half a day. The old spiritual master squatted down and lightly patted his disciple's back, saying, "It's your master's fault for not being capable enough." Zhang Shanfeng turned around and said with a pitiful expression, "Master, you saying this won't make me feel any better." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled faintly and replied, "But this makes your master feel slightly less guilty." Zhang Shanfeng took a deep breath and was just about to stand up. However, he immediately squatted down and continued to vomit. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was just about to criticize himself again. Yet a group of cultivators from Infant Mountain who were flying past overhead immediately roared in laughter upon seeing the young Taoist priest's awkward state. Zhang Shanfeng had no time to worry about these matters. His head was throbbing and his vision was spinning. The old spiritual master silently vanished at this moment, arriving behind two flying earth immortals and placing his hands on their heads as he said with a wide smile, "What's so funny? Care to share the joke with me? I also want to have a good laugh." The earth immortals went numb with fear, immediately tensing up and shrinking back like terrified little chicks. One of them mustered their courage and replied, "We're simply overjoyed about coming across old immortal." The other earth immortal was slightly slower in coming to their senses, and they hurriedly exclaimed, "Absolutely delighted. I'm ecstatic about this chance encounter with old immortal." With a light push, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon sent the two earth immortals stumbling forward. He then returned to Zhang Shanfeng's side with a smile. Zhang Shanfeng was completely oblivious to his master's departure and return. After he stood up, Zhang Shanfeng wiped the sweat from his forehead and said, "Master, we can keep going now." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and said, "There's no rush, take things slowly. There's plenty of time for cultivators, and walking too quickly will make it easy to miss some of the scenery. I want to deliver those water elixirs to Changping'an as early as possible," Zhang Shanfeng grumbled. The old spiritual master nodded and performed some calculations. They could indeed make haste regarding this matter. Inside a ruin at the Golden Armor continent, Lu Yuzhou yawned as he watched the battle nearby. That young woman in white continued to throw punches, and by the looks of it, she had truly become addicted to this. Chao Ci didn't counterattack, nor did he say anything. Instead, he continued to look at the haphazardly fallen deity statues. From time to time, he would kneel and bow to the deity statues, clasp his hands in a prayer toward the statues, or simply bow toward the statues. Meanwhile, the young female with surging fist intent simply continued to throw punches. Lu Yuzhou wasn't a pure martial artist, but he felt like her attacks were becoming increasingly chaotic and disorderly, completely following her whim. She no longer unleashed her full power with each punch either. However, this seemingly made no difference to Chao Ci, and he continued to observe the deity statues no matter how he was attacked by her punches. The young woman suddenly stopped, with the flesh on her fingers and the back of her hands already ground away to reveal bone. "Am I still wrong?" she asked in a solemn voice. Chao Ci turned around and replied with a smile, "Why do you say that? Are punches that fail to fell me wrong? If that's the case, then does anyone in the world at the same age as me possess a correct fist technique?" Chao Ci rarely spoke, but he surprisingly continued by saying, "There is no such thing as a wrong fist technique in the world. There are only martial artists who have practiced fist techniques incorrectly, as well as those who fail to attack with sufficient intent." The young woman gritted her teeth and corrected, "It's not failing to fell you, it's failing to hit you at all." Chao Ci replied with a nod. He fell silent again. Since this was the glaring reality, anyone who wasn't blind would be able to see and understand it. It was very easy for Chao Ci to say some polite words, but to the young woman, what benefits did this yield? If a pure martial artist who had ambitions of reaching the pinnacle couldn't even accept a few truthful remarks, then how could their fist intent possibly rise up and eventually find solid footing at the pinnacle of the mountains? Regarding this point, the person whom he had encountered at the Sword Chi Great Wall back then had done very well, willing to accept his fate. In reality, accepting one's fate was for the sake of being able to eventually challenge fate one day in the future. Chao Ci recalled something as he continued to walk forward, and he asked, "Do you remember how many punches you've thrown?" "I didn't pay attention to this," the young woman replied with a shake of her head. With his back facing her, Chao Ci suggested slowly, "Then focus on remembering this from this point onward. You don't need to consider how you're throwing punches, nor do you need to consider the release and retraction of your power. You simply need to count how many punches you've thrown." The young woman frowned and asked, "Chao Ci, why are you willing to provide me with guidance regarding fist techniques?" Chao Ci gazed up at the sky and replied, "This can't be viewed as guidance per se. It's worthy of a few comments from me, so I've decided to make these comments to you. This isn't anything special or remarkable. You can also do the same when you encounter other martial artists in the future, and you presumably will. The path of martial arts isn't a narrow one where it's kill or be killed. As for martial fortune, it's even more the case that, forget about it. It seems slightly inappropriate to discuss this with you." The young woman smiled bitterly and remarked, "That's because you're destined to never come across a person at the same age who can make you feel despair. That's why you're able to say this." Chao Ci nodded and said, "There's no need for me to think about this." The young woman gritted her teeth in slight frustration and anger. True martial artists are pure in their focus, and they won't display what's perceived as the anger of common people all the time, Chao Ci commented. Lu Yuzhou clicked his tongue in wonder. It was rare for Chao Ci to say so much in such a short period of time. Perhaps this was the so-called pure focus that Chao Ci talked about. One had to realize that after this young woman advanced to the Vajrabhati tier as the strongest 6th-tier martial artist in the world, Chao Ci would have essentially gained a powerful new rival at the same level. At the very least, their cultivation bases would be the same. As for the level of their fist techniques at that time, the young woman was likely well aware that she would still feel complete and utter despair. She was so disheveled while fighting the 7th-tier Chao Ci at the 6th tier herself, so how would she feel if she were still unable to touch him even after advancing to the 7th tier? Even Lu Yuzhou would feel distressed for her at that time. On a bustling street in a provincial city of the heavenly world, a young and carefree Taoist priest was manning a stall by the roadside, claiming that his palm-reading skills were an exceptional ability passed down by his ancestors. There were many young women and mature ladies at his stall. As for his junior brother, this city was his hometown, and he had chosen to travel at night in brocade robes after witnessing a tragic story that pertained to a cultivator seeking revenge. The young boy found someone at the same age who was like a brother, as well as a young girl with whom he had been friends from a young age. The young Taoist priest recited a mantra in a mystical manner as he stroked a beautiful young lady's smooth and supple hand, thinking about his junior brother as he did so. Would his junior brother forgive his good friend, whom he had initially viewed as an older brother? Would his junior brother plead with him to bring that young girl back to the White Jade capital? This was another small story that wasn't very joyful. The young Taoist priest was quite curious about what choices would be made. There was actually a large number of possible choices, and at the end of the day, everything was dependent on how his junior brother viewed the pursuit of Tao. Lu Chun gently put down the dainty hand of the beautiful young lady, and revealed to her some matters pertaining to her marriage. He turned around and looked toward someplace, not feeling disappointed per se, but not feeling surprised or delighted either. His junior brother was silently shedding tears as he held the corpse of someone the same age as him. Meanwhile, the young girl standing beside him was transfixed with shock, as if she had been struck by lightning. In Lu Chen's eyes, she appeared slightly innocent and adorable at this moment. Killing one person meant crushing 3 hearts. It was difficult to say whether this was a profitable transaction or an unprofitable one. Lu Chun rested his cheek on one hand as he looked at the busy street, replying with a faint smile to a lady who had stopped to glance back at him from a distance. The young lady most likely hadn't expected the handsome Taoist priest to notice her gaze, hurriedly twisting her slender waist and lowering her head as she walked away in embarrassment. One could never grow tired of the smiles of young ladies. Lu Chun surmised that he would still enjoy the smiles of young ladies, even after looking at them for another 10,000 years. He sighed and concluded that his junior brother had done so. He had killed someone else and also killed himself, just barely passing this trial of the Tao heart. If this weren't the case, then Lu Chan wouldn't have minded throwing a palm strike and smashing his junior brother into a pile of crushed flesh and bone. However, his junior brother's performance was still a fair way off from his best expectations. A person's body was a small world, so when one cultivated the great Tao, how could the two vast principles of heaven and earth and tranquility be so small? The more Lu Chan thought about this, the more displeased he became. He angrily grabbed a bamboo slip from the tube and lightly snapped it in half. His junior brother crumpled to the ground as if a flying sword had hacked him apart at the waist. He didn't die. He was only half dead. His junior brother possessed 3 paramount immortal treasures of the White Jade capital, after all, so how could he die so easily? Another Lu Chan arrived beside his junior brother, who was still able to struggle even after being hacked into 2, squatting down and encouraging with a smile. "Give it your all, junior brother, you can definitely survive if you manage to mend yourself together." As for the Lu Chan who was manning the fortune-telling stall by the roadside, he smiled widely and extended his hand toward the young girl who had already sat down, saying, "I'm exceptionally skilled at reading palms, and my accuracy in predicting marriages is so great that I'm essentially a sworn brother of the matchmaking deity." On the bank of a large river in the residence of the southern world continent's pure Confucian Chan clan, Lu Xianyang discovered for the first time that the old Confucian scholar was standing atop the waterside rock cliff earlier than he was. After making his way up the rock cliff, Lu Xianyang bowed in respect and greeted the old man. The two of them met often, with the old man saying that he was a teacher. The pure Confucian Chan clan had an academy, and many people sought knowledge here to begin with even more visiting during their travels. Thus, Lu Xianyang didn't find it strange that many people didn't recognize this old man. Lu Xianyang discovered that the old scholar was a bit different today, not asking him about his progress in studies or whether he had any questions about the scriptures, as he normally would. The old scholar had once said that if one's knowledge was shallow, it would be a bad idea for one to deviate from the scriptures. As one became more knowledgeable, it would also be inappropriate for one to rigidly follow the scriptures and be pointlessly pedantic about each phrase. The knowledge in the world needed to be gradually modified and improved after all. The old scholar stood on the rock cliff and gazed at the river, remaining silent for a long time before turning around and asking, "Lu Xianyang, what do you think about the pure Confucian Chan clan's family culture and learning culture?" Lu Xianyang was slightly surprised by this question. The old scholar had first posed this question to him during their first encounter, so he was unsure why the old scholar was asking him the same question again. Lu Xianyang's reply was pretty much the same as before. "Good. Where is it good?" the old scholar asked. "Good in the sense that it's practical," Lu Xianyang replied with a smile. "Then it's truly not bad," the old scholar said with a nod. "What was old Mr. thinking about before?" Lu Xianyang asked in a soft voice. "Old people always think about the arrangements after their death," the old scholar replied with a smile. Lu Xianyang was rendered speechless. "Young people shouldn't be so dull and lifeless," the old scholar remarked. "You need to be energetic and spirited, daring to point out the shortcomings and faults of the world, and daring to contemplate how you'll use the knowledge in the books to better the world." "I'll strive to achieve this," Lu Xianyang replied with a nod. "Looking at youths like yourself, old people like me can't help but feel that there's insufficient time to make use of. I still haven't had enough of teaching yet." The old scholar sighed with emotion. Lu Xianyang also sighed in response. The old scholar chuckled. "Don't sigh, your fortune will run away." Lu Xianyang faltered upon hearing this. There existed such a notion? The old scholar smiled and continued. "This was how the seniors in the clan scared me when I was little." Lu Xianyang found this quite amusing. In his memory, Chan Ping'an would never sigh for no reason. Meanwhile, he and the snotty little kid would often lie under the tree shade in summer or on the field ridges at night, sighing at each other and not finding this boring. They would do this for fun. Back then, Chan Ping'an had always been the most unfortunate person. Now that he was a mountain master in their hometown, had his fortune finally taken a turn for the better? On the 10th day of the 10th month, Chan Ping'an set sail on the talisman boat prepared by Paddling Island and made his way to the main island of the Dragon Palace Small World. Incense smoke filled the air, and even cultivators were burning paper afterlife garments, adhering to ancient etiquette as they offered clothes to their ancestors. Chen Ping'an was no exception, and he purchased many 5-colored winter clothes crafted from paper by the water dragon sect, bringing a brimming basket back to Paddling Island. He then wrote names on each of the garments, and he used the small and ordinary cauldron gifted to him by the shop to burn the garments and offer them to the deceased. Chen Ping'an burned these paper garments the next day, which was the 11th day of the 10th month. It was said that burning paper clothes shouldn't be done on the day of the Ghost Festival, and it should instead be done on the day before or the day after. This wouldn't disturb one's ancestors, and it would also allow one's ancestors and the other ghosts and deities to reap the most benefits. There were some customs of the water dragon sect that Chen Ping'an was quite familiar with. For example, they would also add new soil when paying respects at their ancestors' tombs, identical to the practice at Chen Ping'an's hometown. There were many other similarities. For example, men should kowtow but shouldn't cry, while the reverse was true for women. Chen Ping'an spent 2 entire hours burning the paper clothes. Standing amid the sea of clouds, water official Li Yuan couldn't help but feel a little dazed as he watched on. In fact, he almost failed to contain his urge to look at the names written on the large number of 5-colored winter clothes. Upon recalling Li Lu's address of him as Mr. Chan, however, Li Yuan didn't dare to stick his nose where it didn't belong. On the 15th day of the 10th month, the birthday of the water official Great Emperor, the Water Dragon sect would host a grand gold edict ceremony, fasting and performing rituals to ward off misfortune and calamity for their ancestors, helping them accumulate fortune at the same time. Compared to the expenditure for purchasing some 5-colored winter clothes for the Ghost Festival, wanting to offer incense and lights during the gold edict ceremony would cost far more than just a few snowflake coins. Chen Ping'an actively opened the formation of Paddling Island, upon which Li Yuan pretended that he had made his way over after noticing the change. Chen Ping'an asked some detailed questions about the rules of the gold edict ceremony, eventually handing Li Yuan a notebook that was densely filled with names and personal information. He then handed the water official 2 grain rain coins. Chen Ping'an asked Li Yuan to participate in the gold edict ceremony for him, where he could ask some mighty figures of the water dragon sect to write the names in the notebook on those specially made talisman papers, helping these deceased individuals accumulate fortune for their future lives. Li Yuan truly couldn't help himself this time, and he asked, "Dare I ask, Mr. Chan, who these deceased individuals are? I'm just doing my best to rectify some past mistakes. This is far from enough, but hopefully it's not too late to have some positive impact," Chen Ping'an replied. Holding the notebook in his hand, Li Yuan nodded and said, "Rest assured, the heavens can detect this, and ghosts and deities can also share their senses. Don't underestimate your earnest sincerity." And thus, Li Yuan went over to personally attend to this matter. Chen Ping'an jumped onto the roof ridge, taking Sword Immortal with him and placing it horizontally across his knees. He sat by himself and looked around in a daze. Chen Ping'an had already stayed at Paddling Island for close to 10 days, asking Li Yuan to help him complete 2 tasks during this time. Apart from the gold edict ceremony for the birthday of the water official Great Emperor, Chen Ping'an had also asked Li Yuan to help him deliver a letter to Downtrodden Mountain. Chen Ping'an was unable to guess this person's identity. He had the appearance of a young man, yet he looked utterly exhausted and lacking in spirit, seemingly as if he had reached a barrier in cultivation. Chen Ping'an had observed this lack of spirit and this type of gradual decay of the soul in old cultivators who were resigned to the fact that they would never attain the Great Tao. Moreover, Li Yuan would never enter the island of his own accord unless he noticed changes in the protection formation of Paddling Island. There was one thing that caused Chen Ping'an to feel increasingly confused. Just what had Li Lu's cultivation looked like in the northern complete reed continent over the past few years? However, he was unable to find a single record or mention in the many newspapers from the mountains. Chen Ping'an ceaselessly refined the spiritual energy of the mountains and waters while he stayed at Paddling Island, stabilizing and expanding 2 critical acupoints of his water palace. He would occasionally focus his mind to perform internal observations and patrols as well, watching that burst of sword chi ferociously attacking the barrier like an army of heavy cavalry charging at an enemy formation. There were also 1st and 15th sharpening their tips on the dragon-slaying platforms, sending sparks flying into the surroundings, similar to the dazzling scene of Master Ruan forging swords at the small town. The Dragon Palace small world was like spring all year round, neither being frigidly cold in winter, nor being scorching hot in summer. It rained very often, sometimes just a light drizzle, but sometimes a heavy downpour. Qian Ping'an discovered that whenever it rained, some cultivators on the nearby islands, most of them earth immortals, would either bathe in the rain and open up the small world of their bodies to voraciously absorb the spiritual energy of the mist and raindrops, or they would retrieve immortal treasures such as jade vessels or inkstone water holders to catch the rainwater, not allowing a single drop to land on their islands. When Qian Ping'an had spare time, he started to read the collection of stories where the final fate of everyone was inescapable death. Their journeys were all different, with their personalities also being wide-ranging and varied. Similarly, their deaths were also unique and bizarre, with their killers coming from all kinds of weird and wonderful backgrounds. The flow of time had stopped while atop the mountain peak of the immortal ruins back then, and this book had fallen to the ground following the death of that great demon, first falling into Taoist Master Sun's hands before being passed on to Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an found an oil paper umbrella with a bamboo handle at Paddling Island, and every time it rained, he would go outside for a walk as long as he wasn't cultivating, regardless of whether it was day or night. He would hold the umbrella and walk by himself, circling the perimeter of Paddling Island, which was approximately 15 kilometers in distance. Of the 3 jade tablets, Qian Ping'an had already removed Li Lu's hornless dragon jade tablet with the characters 3 feet sweet rain, and placed it inside his minimization treasure. Li Yuan's jade tablet, mountain's green rain like mist, which was used to control the formation of the island, was still hanging by his waist, as was the water dragon sex mandarin wood tablet, rest. As Qian Ping'an walked through the rain, the 2 tablets would create a faint, striking sound when he occasionally took slightly bigger steps. As it rained today, Qian Ping'an once again carried the umbrella and strolled around the island. Looking at the time, it wouldn't be long before he received a response letter from Zhu Lian. Qian Ping'an stood still and looked at the area between White Armor Island and Greybeard Island in the distance. An extravagant horse-drawn carriage suddenly dashed out from the lake, with the carriage as large as a pagoda and its curved eaves decorated with bells. As the magnificent snow-white horses sprinted across the lake, the jingling bells played a melody that was seemingly from the raining heavens. Behind the carriage was a small group of maidservants dressed in brocade robes, as well as a large number of officials in red and other subjects and horses, with these people also walking atop the lake. There was no carriage driver commanding the magnificent horses, and there was instead only water official Li Yuan and a slender and beautiful woman. Her hair was like a white jade flower bud, and she was wearing an exquisitely woven short-sleeve robe. Above the robe was a layer of gauze that fluttered like mist. Li Yuan had changed into a round-collar yellow robe, with a white jade belt around his waist and official etiquette boots on his feet. When this entourage appeared, Qian Ping'an noticed a strange phenomenon at White Armor Island and Greybeard Island, with the surrounding mist permeating onto the shores and enveloping the islands, leaving only their silhouettes visible. However, Qian Ping'an couldn't say for sure whether this was caused by the cultivators on the islands activating the island protection formations, or whether it was someone from the entourage using a water technique to block the gazes of the cultivators on the islands. The carriage raced toward Qian Ping'an's general direction, not directly entering Paddling Island and instead stopping on the water 500 meters away. Only Li Yuan and the slender woman stepped off the carriage and walked toward the island. The woman seemingly deactivated an illusion technique, revealing her initially fuzzy appearance. She had a pair of golden eyes, and it was clear that she was a local deity. Li Yuan and the beautiful woman arrived before Qian Ping'an, and Li Yuan introduced with a smile, "This is the esteemed water goddess of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, and she's responsible for the wind and rain of the Dragon Palace Small World. Young Master Qian can refer to her as Lady Qian." Even though it was raining quite heavily, Qian Ping'an still chose to immediately put his oil paper umbrella away, politely greeting Lady Qian. Lady Qian curtsied in respect and greeted. The Southern Fragrance Water Palace's Qian Lin pays her respects to young Master Qian. After standing up straight, she gently flicked her sleeve and halted the rain at Paddling Island. Qian Ping'an was accustomed to looking at other people's eyes when he spoke, so he accidentally caught sight of Lady Qian's true appearance. Her face was the color of green glaze, and not only that, but her porcelain face was also filled with a dense web of crisscrossing fractures. Looking closely, this was quite a terrifying sight. Qian Ping'an came to a slight understanding, and he didn't try to pretend that he hadn't seen anything. He placed the oil paper umbrella under his armpit and cupped his fists in apology to the water goddess whose godly body was on the verge of shattering. Xinlin was seemingly a little astonished as she smiled and said, "There's no need to apologize, young Master Chan. If this minor god's appearance has frightened young master and ruined the atmosphere, then I'm the one who should be apologizing for my great crime." Li Yuan laughed heartily, seemingly finding this remark quite amusing. However, Chan Ping'an didn't laugh, so Li Yuan could only huff and stop laughing as well, having made a fool of himself. If those people standing at the forefront of the water dragon sect's ancestral hall many years ago were still alive, they would have already broken into loud laughter along with him. Holding the oil paper umbrella in one hand, Chan Ping'an turned to his side and gestured with his other hand. Xinlin glanced at Li Yuan, and the latter hurriedly signaled with his eyes. Only then did she walk side by side with young Master Chan. Li Yuan wrapped his hands behind his head and slowly walked behind the two of them. The Southern Fragrance Water Palace enjoyed the highest standing among all of the water god residences in the Dragon Palace small world. As for the mountain gods, they naturally had the lowest standing in this small world, appearing like minor deities who were imprisoned by vast bodies of water on all sides. Some heroic spirits who were waiting to be appointed to positions by the Imperial Lu clan of the Great Origin Empire, or the spirits of some renowned minor nations, would all feel petrified when they heard that they might be tossed into the Dragon Palace small world to become deities there. In fact, they might even feel like dying a second time. This was due to more than just selfishness, being afraid that there would be too many restrictions in the small world, and also the fact that mountain gods would receive far less incense offerings than water gods. More importantly, after they left their hometowns and entered the small world to become deities, how could they possibly nurture the mountain and water fortunes of their home nations? Thus, being appointed to become a deity of a small world was viewed as a form of demotion and banishment by all heroic spirits. They would rather become city gods of small county cities rather than mountain gods of small worlds. Xinlin had referred to herself as an old deity of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, something that was worth ruminating on. This was because the Dragon Palace small world had more than 1,000 islands in an area of 4,000 kilometers in radius, with the abundance of water fortune in this small world being unrivaled in the continent. There were 32 water gods, lake lords, and river guardians in total, and there were additionally mountain gods, city lords, scholarly temples, and martial sage temples in the 12 large islands, as well as the main city. In fact, these deities numbered even more than the water deities. Li Yuan looked at the lady walking in front of him, sighing in grief in his mind as he did so. They were both suffering the same miserable fate. However, what the Water Dragon sect could do was only limited, largely relying on the annual Gold Edict ceremony to increase incense offerings and repair the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, similar to how buildings were repaired in the mortal world. This was ultimately less direct and effective than how Li Yuan, the water official, absorbed incense offerings to refine their essence. At the end of the day, this was where small worlds were inferior to blessed lands. Small worlds were only suitable for cultivators who wanted to cultivate in peace, able to provide a tranquil environment that strongly promoted peace and aloofness. On the other hand, blessed lands were vast and populated, making them beneficial for accumulating the incense offerings of countless people. They were the natural temples of gods and deities. Chan Ping'an enjoyed a pleasant conversation with Lady Shan. However, it was a shame that, unlike the two immortal forces, the Spring Dew Garden and the Rainbow Sparrow Residence, the Dragon Palace small world didn't have any books that introduced the local traditions and customs of the region. In reality, this was the first time that Chan Ping'an had heard of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace. However, deities who enjoyed the title of Water Majesty often possessed impressive backgrounds. At Bamboo Scroll Lake, Lu Chongrun was the island master of Bejeweled Hairpin Island, which was located near Cyan Gorge Island. As the princess of a fallen nation, her home nation had once had a fabled water palace, thus drawing the coveting gazes of a sword cultivator from the luminous Vermilion Empire. Of course, that nascent tier sword cultivator from the royal family of the empire had yearned to obtain both wealth and the beautiful princess. Chan Ping'an had witnessed the mystical power of precious alchemical pills from water palaces before, and these were valuable treasures that even earth immortals would salivate over. According to Lu Chongruan's explanation, Casually tossing out one of the most valuable water elixirs of the water palace could easily trigger tumult at Bamboo Scroll Lake, with everyone rushing over to fight for its ownership. Before Qian Ping'an left Downtrodden Mountain, Lu Chongrun had yet to finalize her relocation plans with Zhu Lian. In reality, Qian Ping'an didn't understand why Lu Chongrun insisted on splitting the female cultivators of Bejeweled Hairpin Island into two groups. Apart from the ancestral hall being kept at Bamboo Scroll Lake, the majority of direct disciples would be relocated to the Dragon Spring Prefecture to cultivate. Bamboo Scroll Lake had adopted new rules and regulations now, and there was also Jiang Shangzhen's True Realm sect to oversee the region, making it completely different from before, when lawlessness had reigned over the islands. To put things bluntly, the True Realm sect genuinely wouldn't have any interest in taking Lu Chongruan's measly amount of treasures. Moreover, she would still be at the behest of other people even after relocating to the Dragon Spring Prefecture. Qian Ping'an wouldn't give Bejeweled Hairpin Island any discount at all, not a single immortal coin. Bejeweled Hairpin Island was moving many people, and Lu Chongrun was also spending a huge sum of money to facilitate this relocation. Qian Ping'an truly couldn't understand why Lu Chongrun was willing to go ahead with this transaction. This was similar to how Qian Ping'an didn't understand the relationship between Li Lu and Li Yuan, nor did he understand the link between Shen Lin and Li Yuan. Thus, he was simply making polite small talk as he walked beside the water goddess of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace. Qian Ping'an had already grown accustomed to making polite small talk during his time at Bamboo Scroll Lake Cyan Gorge Island, so he was extremely practiced and flawless as he conversed with Lady Shen, speaking in a polite manner but not sounding distant or cold. For example, he modestly asked Shen Lin about the history of the Immortal Ascension tablets on Paddling Island, and she explained everything she knew. Along with water official Li Yuan, she was one of the two most experienced ancient deities of the Dragon Palace Small World, so she naturally knew everything about the people and matters of her jurisdiction. Li Yuan listened to the casual and friendly conversation between the two people walking in front of him. This was only their first encounter. He found this fairly amusing. At the same time, however, he also felt slightly melancholy. Countless years had passed, and that lofty ruler of the martial world had finally decided to visit the Dragon Palace Small World of the Plenty River summer residence again. Yet what was the outcome? She hadn't bothered to visit the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, not even taking the effort to reprimand water goddess Shen Lin, who should have at least been commended for her hard work, even if she wasn't commended for her merit. In fact, Li Yuan could say with certainty that if it weren't for Mr. Chen's visit, that ruler of the martial world wouldn't have even spared an extra glance for him, the water official of the Plenty River who had guarded this summer residence for countless years. She was truly cold-hearted. Li Yuan always felt like he and Shen Lin could be regarded as relatively high-ranking deities, lofty enough to brush aside all mortal feelings and relationships. Compared to that unreachably paramount primordial goddess, however, they truly appeared like those extremely emotional and obsessed mortals. Shen Lin was seemingly in a very talkative mood today, actively introducing the traditions and customs of the Dragon Palace Small World to young Master Qian. This was also what Qian Ping'an was most willing to listen to and learn about. Indeed, this had always been the case ever since Qian Ping'an had embarked on his first distant journey with little Baoping and the others. Asking woodsmen for information in the mountains, asking boatmen for information in the rivers, and asking the locals for information in the cities and towns, Qian Ping'an had personally done all of this back then. Qian Ping'an wouldn't have felt reassured even if Li Baoping, who had considered problems most earnestly and completed tasks most diligently, had wanted to share these duties and burdens with her junior uncle. Afterward, Qian Ping'an had done the same while traveling around the various continents by himself. Qian Ping'an would inevitably feel uneasy if he were in an unfamiliar place and unable to fully understand the area. A large factor behind this was most likely the many troubles that Qian Ping'an had faced in the past. Being stopped by the female ghost in the wedding dress, the disaster at the Flying Eagle Fortress, accidentally entering the Lotus Flower Blessed Land, and the killing intent that he had faced at Malicious Ghost Valley. Qian Ping'an knew that if his mind became extreme regarding this matter, failing to change for the better, then this would become a barrier on his path of cultivation. Qian Ping'an suddenly realized this after coming across Li Lu again. This was because after comparing his own behavior to Li Lu's speech and actions here, he discovered that he would never feel at ease unless he were sitting by himself in his ancestral residence in Clay Vase Alley. Even in his hometown, he would still be accustomed to the paranoid habit of knowing everything, regardless of how trivial the matters were. This was the case at the bamboo building in Downtrodden Mountain, and it was also the case at the two shops on Dragon Riding Alley. This was the reason why Qian Ping'an was so envious of those two immortal mystical abilities, the land-shortening technique and the immortal observation technique. This realization had become especially glaring when Li Lu had casually said that if Mr. Qian couldn't calm his mind, then he would only be going in circles no matter how far he traveled. Her words had jolted Qian Ping'an awake. Qian Ping'an dared to say that he always knew what he wanted, where he wanted to go, and what type of person he wanted to become. As he journeyed around the world and walked along the path of cultivation, however, it turned out that the many bumps and challenges hadn't all been thrown at him by fate and destiny. Indeed, many of them had been invited by Qian Ping'an himself. It was because of this that Qian Ping'an had sat on the roof ridge that night, looking around in a daze and not knowing how to take the next step. He had promised that he would become a Vajrabhati tier martial artist and return to Stalactite Mountain in 10 years. He wanted to reconstruct his Bridge of Immortality and successfully refine 5 bonded items. He wanted to become a genuine sword cultivator and strive to become a truly free great sword immortal. However, human power had its limits, and the same went for mental power. In any case, were these 3 major matters the limit of Qian Ping'an's complicated thoughts? Were his worries as simple as having a debt of several thousand grain rain coins? Were his responsibilities as simple as a few personal matters? There was a myriad of chaotic matters, some big and some small. How should these matters be prioritized? And how should he use his energy and time to transform his principles into tangible actions? Qian Ping'an subconsciously stopped in his tracks. The water goddess of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace also came to a smooth stop. Li Yuan had nothing better to do while walking behind the two people, so he had carefully looked over Shunlin's Dao robe that weighed at least 3 to 4 ounces, counting the number of inlaid jewels that were refined into minuscule sizes and special products of the Dragon Palace Small World. He had already counted more than 9,000. Shunlin's visit wasn't Li Yuan's idea, but rather, the temporary visit of that ruler of the martial world had caused the water goddess of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace to imperceptibly notice her presence. However, Shunlin hadn't dared to visit without permission, so she could only follow the traces and carefully find her way to the water official of the Plenty River following the disappearance of that vague feeling. Not only that, but she hadn't dared to ask direct questions either, beating around the bush and giving Li Yuan a slight headache. Even so, he had continued to act stupid and play dumb. Regardless of how much he pitied this water goddess, Li Yuan still didn't dare to reveal any secrets regarding such a major matter. However, he was truly unable to withstand Shunlin's persistence and barrage of questions, so he could only come up with a solution that was relatively fair and didn't use official authority for private affairs, leading her to Paddling Island. She was the leading deity of this small world in any case, so patrolling the mountains and waters of the small world was naturally part of her responsibility. However, it was a shame that Mr. Qian, whom Li Yuan referred to as young Master Qian, wasn't wearing that 3 feet sweet rain jade tablet by his waist. He was still a young man, but he was shockingly experienced and careful. He was very cautious with his words, so Shunlin would presumably have to leave without managing to get any answers. Even though the Southern Fragrance Water Palace enjoyed the highest standing among all mountain and water gods in the small world, it didn't necessarily have much legitimacy. This was because no mortal nation or empire had any ability to appoint deities to the water palace, and the mountain masters of the Confucian academies largely wouldn't become involved in this matter either. For example, Sage Zhoumi of a Confucian academy had instructed a noble scholar to deliver 10 appointment edicts to the ancestral hall of the Water Dragon sect soon after assuming his position. These edicts pertained to the various deity positions of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, with only the space for the names left empty. The noble scholar asked sect leader Sun Jie to pass these edicts to the Southern Fragrance Water Palace in the Dragon Palace Small World, and the intention of this was very clear. The small imperial court at the Water Palace was already very bloated, so Shunlin could decide how to deal with this matter herself. Zhoumi had come to the northern complete reed continent to obtain knowledge, not to deal with these messy matters. Shunlin had quickly repaid the favor, not only leaving several of the critical deity positions untouched, but even abolishing many nominal positions that had only been created due to ancient customs and etiquette. In the end, she had adhered to the positions listed in Sage Zhoumi's edict to leave 10 formal deity positions recognized by the Confucian sect in addition to the original 20 or so water deities of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace. In the beginning, Southern sect leader Xiao Jingji, who had a very close relationship with the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, had privately persuaded Lady Shen to not follow this path, abolishing more than a dozen deity positions for no good reason. After all, Sage Zhoumi had already made it abundantly clear that he wouldn't interfere with the operations of the Water Palace, so was there any need to take things this far? After Zhoumi left the Confucian Academy and pummeled the powerful cultivators who had spoken in a vile manner, however, Xiao Jingji had paid another visit to the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, admitting that she had almost caused trouble for Lady Shen. Shen Lin noticed that the young man beside her was dazed and absent-minded. She didn't find this disrespectful, especially since a cultivator being able to relax their mind so much was a formless display of trust. Chen Ping'an quickly pushed aside his messy thoughts and apologized. "I'm sorry, Lady Shen, my mind was wandering a bit just then." Shen Lin smiled and shook her head. She was already planning to leave, so she invited the young man to visit the Southern Fragrance Water Palace if he had time. Chen Ping'an nodded and said he would. He couldn't help but feel a bit exasperated at this moment. Li Lu had told him that she was going to visit the main city and then return to Paddling Island, but following her departure, she had most likely left the Dragon Palace Small World and even left the Water Dragon sect. Chen Ping'an asked Li Yuan about this, with the water official replying that he didn't know. Shen Lin bade farewell and took her leave, walking toward the shore with mist rising from her feet. She arrived atop her carriage in an instant, turning it around and rapidly dashing into the distance. After traveling several kilometers, the entourage seemingly entered a path underwater, with the carriage, the maidservants, and the officials all vanishing in a flash. Li Yuan retracted his gaze. However, he was actually feeling a slight sense of pity in his heart. If this young man were slightly smarter, or slightly less smart depending on how one looked at it, then he would have realized that Shen Lin wasn't simply inviting him to visit the Southern Fragrance Water Palace. She would definitely thank him with valuable gifts, ones that couldn't be turned down no matter what. In addition, these gifts would be completely reasonable and justified, and they would at least be a paramount treasure of the Water Palace. In other words, a paramount water element treasure that was bordering on the level of pseudo-celestial tools. In reality, these gifts wouldn't technically be for the young man, and they would instead be like tributes meticulously chosen and prepared by the local officials, offered to the owner of that 3 feet sweet rain jade tablet. If young Master Chen were willing to accept this gift, then not only would Shen Lin not feel pain to part with the paramount treasure, but she would even feel increasingly grateful to him for accepting the gift. If he displayed even the slightest appetite for more, then Shen Lin would be willing to go as far as to demolish half of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace. Even so, she would definitely still thank him with valuable gifts. However, it was a shame that Mr. Chen had silently let slip this fated opportunity. Was there any cultivator in the world who was displeased about having too many valuable immortal treasures? Was there any deity in the world who was unhappy with receiving too much incense essence? Probably not, right? It was too bad that Li Yuan couldn't say anything to inform Chen Ping'an, or else he might make matters even worse for the severely decaying Shen Lin if he accidentally gilded the lily. At the same time, he might also cause trouble for himself, a measly water official. Chen Ping'an also saw the carriage off with his gaze, silently observing the quick flash of complicated expressions on the face of the water official standing beside him. Li Yuan retrieved a secret letter and said, "Mr. Chen, this is the reply letter from your hometown. The Water Dragon sect didn't notice anything regarding the delivery of your letter, and the receipt of this letter. In reality, this letter weighed quite heavily in the hand. This was due to mountains and waters being different from each other. This letter had the intricate restriction of a formal mountain god. Thus, it was inevitable that the letter would feel slightly hot and heavy in the hands of a water official." Chen Ping'an accepted the secret letter and smiled knowingly when he saw the 4 large characters on the envelope. For Master to open. It was clear that his opening disciple had written this, with her calligraphy style taking after her master. The characters were straight and proper, and it was evident that Pei Qian had been extremely focused when writing these 4 characters. Chen Ping'an placed the secret letter into his sleeve. Li Yuan was just about to bid farewell. After all, Li Lu had said before that Mr. Chen was going to cultivate in peace here, and no one was allowed to disturb him. The water goddess of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, visiting the island and entering for a moment, already caused Li Yuan to feel slightly uneasy and afraid. However, he thought to himself that the young man strolling around with an umbrella most probably wasn't classified as cultivating in peace, right? Rain quickly started to fall again following Shenlin's departure from Paddling Island. Chen Ping'an raised his umbrella, and Li Yuan said with a smile, "There's no need to mind me, Mr. Chen." Chen Ping'an wanted to say something, but he couldn't help but hesitate. He quickly pushed aside his urge to ask those questions. What was the benefit of knowing Lady Shen's approximate rank in the Dragon Palace small world? Was he truly going to pick up this thread to another matter? There seemingly wasn't a need to do so. Li Yuan couldn't conceal his aging aura, and the godly body of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace's Lady Shen was also on the verge of collapse. Chen Ping'an had only just arrived here, so if he picked up 1 or 2 threads that were buried deep beneath the water and learned of the truth, did he need to become involved if these matters aligned or clashed with some of his principles? There were many external matters that he could choose to ignore, so if he insisted on getting involved and causing headaches for himself, was this the opposite extreme to those cultivators who completely ignored all external matters? Chen Ping'an felt like he needed to make sense of this fundamental matter. To him, this was a significant task of cultivating the heart. With this in mind, Chen Ping'an actually felt slightly envious of those people who had extremely firm Tao-seeking hearts, right from the very beginning, disregarding good and evil and only focusing on one's true self. For example, Lin Shui had immediately taken a fancy to the recite atop cloud scripture, and the young girl Zhu Lu had a very clear goal and an extremely resolute mind. "Mr. Chen, you appear to have some questions on your mind?" Li Yuan asked. This was nonsense. After all, a cultivator who didn't have worries and questions on their mind wouldn't waste their time walking around with an umbrella whenever it rained. Not only that, but Chen Ping'an would frequently stop as well, with his mind feeling restless and distracted. From time to time, he would also retrieve his hiking pole and seemingly write or draw talismans on the ground. "I was just getting a bit impatient waiting for the reply letter from my hometown." "It's nothing," Chen Ping'an replied with a smile. Li Yuan didn't ask anything else. Chen Ping'an returned to his residence after bidding farewell to Li Yuan, closing his oil paper umbrella and leaning it diagonally against the wall outside. The heavy downpour was yet to subside. After lightly shaking off the rain on his body and entering his room to sit down, Chen Ping'an opened the envelope and took out 2 letters, but he didn't open them. The first letter was from Zhu Lian, carefully describing Downtrodden Mountain's current situation, as well as the situation of the Dragon Spring Prefecture and its surroundings. The other letter was from Pei Qian. It only addressed some small, trivial matters. In reality, Chen Ping'an was already informed of a brilliant piece of news upon receiving the letter. Weibo had already successfully broken through. Otherwise, the secret letter wouldn't have contained a restriction unique to Cloud Drape Mountain. Instead of reading the letters, Chen Ping'an stood up and left the room, standing under the eaves and watching the rain connect heaven and earth. When it rained, one could avoid the rain at home, seek shelter in a foreign land, walk through the rain with an umbrella, or be struck by the rain. Chen Ping'an turned around and looked at the oil paper umbrella that was leaning diagonally against the wall. Perhaps some principles and reasons were like the oil paper umbrella. There was no need to use it when the sky was clear and bright. It only needed to be opened when rain fell from the sky. However, no one knew when it would rain, so should a person always carry an umbrella with them just in case? This was a difficult choice, especially since carrying an umbrella all the time would be extra weight and baggage no matter how minor. Moreover, carrying an umbrella when the sky was clear was sure to draw strange looks from everyone else. In any case, cultivators in the mountains didn't need to carry umbrellas to repel rain. Chen Ping'an felt slightly troubled as he scratched his head, mulling over this question. His final thought as he turned around and returned to his room was that it would have been great if this heavy downpour were a downpour of grain rain coins. It would have been good even if it were a downpour of snowflake coins. A Yuan had just arrived at the Sea of Clouds when water goddess Shenlin arrived soon after him. as long as the two of them wanted to conceal their movements in the Dragon Palace small world. Even the two nascent tier cultivators of the Water Dragon sect who were responsible for guarding this small world wouldn't be able to detect any traces. In any case, the two unpolished Jade tier cultivators of the Water Dragon sect didn't choose to guard the Dragon Palace small world, the foundation of the sect, all year round. This was a silent show of respect to water official Li Yuan and water goddess Shen Lin. Apart from the most prestigious Gold Edict ceremony, sect leader Sun Jia wouldn't enter the small world during Jade Edict ceremonies or Yellow Edict ceremonies. Compared to the northern sect, the southern sect's Xiao Jingji had a better relationship with the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, with Xiao Jingji visiting Shen Lin once every few years. Li Yuan, you're not able to casually say something? Shen Lin asked with a complicated expression. Li Yuan smiled faintly and didn't say anything. Even if he responded with a no, that would at least allow Shen Lin to guess the direction of the correct answer. However, Li Yuan didn't say anything from the beginning to the end, only saying that Mr. Chan was a junior of two old friends. As such, Shen Lin could simply refer to him as young Master Chan. No further information was revealed, so Shen Lin was unable to confirm the truth. That being the case, the water goddess would be gambling with her life if she did anything extra. Shen Lin tried another method, asking in an uncertain voice, "Then I'll go and ask Xiao Jingji?" "You can do whatever you please," Li Yuan replied with a smile. Wisps of light shimmered in Shen Lin's golden eyes as she stared intently at her colleague. Li Yuan's expression remained calm and composed. One was the water official of the Plenty River, and the other was the goddess of the Summer Palace. Their deity ranks were roughly the same, and translated to the mortal world, one was like an attendant responsible for the incense offerings in a shrine, while the other was like a maidservant responsible for the miscellaneous matters in the courtyards. Neither could order around the other, and neither were lofty and indispensable beings. If Shen Lin genuinely went to ask Xiao Jingji about these matters, it could, on the one hand, be regarded as an incredibly minor and trivial matter. On the other hand, if that person learned of Shen Lin's actions and became displeased, Shen Lin spying on her whereabouts would warrant a death penalty. At that time, Shen Lin would no longer need to worry about living for another 300 years with her decaying godly body. A single smack and she would vanish from this world. It wasn't that Li Yuan didn't want to help Shen Lin overcome this tribulation, but rather he didn't dare to. Was he not a mud deity crossing the river as well? Was he not also facing an existential crisis? Agreeing to let Shen Lin enter Paddling Island was already a case of Li Yuan displaying reckless courage and doing her a huge favor. Shen Lin smiled bitterly and remarked, "It's often said that better a close neighbor than a distant relative, and the two of us have already been neighbors for so many years." Li Yuan frowned and cut her off, exclaiming with a gloomy expression, "Water goddess Shen Lin of the Water Palace, I urge you to stop before you go too far." Shen Lin was astonished and frightened, so she could only bow and apologize for her inappropriate remark. Li Yuan flicked his sleeve and left. Shen Lin silently left the sea of clouds, returning to the lake and activating a water-repelling mystical ability as she returned to her residence. Shen Lin didn't directly go to her residence after arriving at the majestic water palace that was as large as a magnificent mortal city. Instead, she would walk through that large entrance with the plaque reading "Calm Wind Gentle Rain" each time she entered and exited, and she would only walk through the side door rather than the main door. The main door was never opened, and this was the case even when the sect leader of the Water Dragon sect visited. In fact, even the clan leader of the Great Origin Empire's esteemed mystery department, and Sword Immortal Li Kai of Duckweed Sword Lake, could only enter through the side door when they visited this majestic water palace. Shen Lin quickly vanished after entering through the side door, arriving beside the flower bed in her courtyard, where she planted all kinds of strange and wonderful things. The rare and exotic birds that swooped through the vegetation and sang on the branches were also species that had long gone extinct in the majestic world. A female deity appeared and reported, "Milady, the southern sect's Xiao Jingji has come to visit. Does Milady want to see her?" Shen Lin hesitated for a moment before shaking her head and replying, "No, just tell her that I'm cultivating in seclusion and don't have time to entertain guests right now." As Shen Lin turned down Xiao Jingji's visit, Li Yuan, meanwhile, was far more relaxed and carefree, activating an illusion technique and disguising himself as an ordinary-looking young man in yellow robes. He appeared on the white jade stairs and slowly descended the mountain, walking through the city gate and making his way to the restaurant on the stone arch bridge to drink wine. He didn't walk up to the 5th level, and he casually picked a seat in the main hall of the 1st level because it was far busier and livelier here. Because the 2 ceremonies had already concluded, the restaurant was nowhere near as packed as before, what with Chen Ping'an barely able to find a table and eventually needing to share a table with 3 other people. There were many more spare tables right now. Li Yuan could come and go as he pleased in the Dragon Palace Small World and on the stone arch bridge spanning the Plenty River, since both could be regarded as territories of the Plenty River. However, following the establishment of the Water Dragon sect and their basic refinement of the Plenty River's middle shrine, Li Yuan's role was to guard the small world and at most, leave the small world to walk back and forth along the long bridge, disguising himself each time. However, there were a few times when he actually walked all the way to the end of the bridge. He had held this responsibility for hundreds of thousands of years, and even if he held it for 10,000 years, completing these tasks would still be expected as part of his role. However, if Li Yuan failed to abide by some rule, even just a single time, then that would be an irredeemable catastrophe for a high-ranking deity such as himself. Shen Lin's godly body was now on the verge of collapse, so she was showing hints of wanting to break the rules and risk her life to maintain her deityhood. Li Yuan truly couldn't bring himself to watch on. In reality, Li Yuan had already given up all hope after seeing the current reincarnation of that person. This was because he was finally able to say for sure that she didn't care about them at all. She didn't care about the life and death of water official Li Yuan and the Southern Fragrance Water Palace's Shen Lin, nor did she care about the collapse of their godly bodies. This was one of the reasons why Li Yuan hadn't provided any further warnings to Shen Lin. Since that person no longer cared about the Dragon Palace Small World and the Plenty River, would she also not care about Shen Lin secretly overstepping the boundaries? What if Shen Lin somehow managed to take a risk and successfully repair her godly body? If that were the case, then could Li Yuan also follow the same path and repair his godly body, thereby extending his lifespan? Truth be told, Li Yuan wasn't particularly fond of this extremely terrible feeling. Thus, he wanted to visit the restaurant that was filled with the scent of the mortal world to drink wine and wash away his sorrows. Li Yuan didn't know what Mr. Chen was worrying about at Paddling Island, needing him to stroll around with an umbrella every time it rained. In any case, Li Yuan felt like he wouldn't be able to wash away all of his sorrows even if all of the rain in the Dragon Palace Small World were turned into wine for him to drink. Not to mention, deities couldn't get drunk regardless of whether they drank mortal wine or immortal wine. Li Yuan wanted to squeeze out a tear to express pity for himself, but even something as simple as this couldn't be done. He started to drink midnight wine, slamming his hands on the table and wailing in pity. He appeared much like a mortal young man who couldn't hold his liquor. "You're too bloody loud, young brat. Shut the hell up!" a nearby customer roared in fury. Li Yuan wiped his face and turned around in pity, lightly sweeping his hands across the table as he replied, "I'm in a bad mood right now, so what's wrong with wailing for a bit? You're affecting my drinking mood, young brat, so tell me, are you looking for a beating?" the man asked with a mocking smile. Li Yuan raised his hands and rubbed his cheeks. He planned to bring this man to the Plenty River, where he could drink some water instead of wine. Not only that, but he could even drink the water for free. Right at this moment, an old man and a young female cultivator coincidentally walked down from a higher level, with the latter wearing a jade tablet by her waist that showed off her status as a direct disciple of the Water Dragon sect's ancestral hall. "Please calm down. Don't ruin the peace and harmony." The old man looked at the man and said with a smile, "Just who the fuck do you think you are, old geezer?" The man chided in anger. "I'm just the person footing the bill." The old man chuckled in response. "I'm paying for all of the wine on the 1st level today, and will treat this as everyone giving me some face." The man was instantly rendered speechless. He stood up and cupped his fists in apology, saying, "Oh, it's Spiritual Master Huan. Please forgive my rudeness." Huan Yun cupped his fists in response and walked down the remaining stairs, paying the bill for all of the customers on the 1st level. This instantly drew cheers and shouts of approval from the customers. Li Yuan glanced at the old man, determining that he was a golden core tier earth immortal who was close to breaking through. The young woman walking beside him had just advanced to the golden core tier, and if memory served him right, her name was Bai Bai or something like that. She was held in relatively high regard by sect leader Sun Jia. Her fortune was indeed quite good, so it was no wonder that Sun Jia was pouring a lot of effort and resources into nurturing her. Sun Jia had insisted on bestowing that inch gold talisman, which even the nascent tier guest elders coveted, to his direct disciple, but even taking into account the fact that Bai Bai had just advanced to the golden core tier, there were still strong suspicions that Sun Jia was doing this to feather his own nest. This had resulted in heated arguments between the northern sect and the southern sect in the ancestral hall, with even Xiao Jingji, who seldom spoke against Sun Jia on the surface, speaking very critically in a rare display. As the true master of the water dragon sect's ancestral hall, Li Yuan had hidden inside the painting of some ancestor to secretly watch the good show. It was quite lively and entertaining. In reality, Sun Jia could be regarded as a fairly good leader. He was fair in his treatment of the northern sect and the southern sect. However, it was exactly because of this that some people felt hard done by. If Sun Jia were willing to abandon his face and blatantly favor the disciples of the northern sect, that could actually reduce a lot of the foul schemes and conflicts. If he appointed the successor of the water dragon sect early on, showing a strong will to continue the sect's tradition of favoring the north and suppressing the south, would Xiao Jingji and the southern sect not suffer even greater hardships? Would they not be forced to lower their heads and yield in the end? However, he was far too easygoing and far too impartial. This was why Sun Jia was unable to win over the elders and disciples of the sect. Otherwise, of the guest elders who were sitting in the same row as the southern sect's Xiao Jingji, 2 or 3 of them would have already shifted their seats to align with the northern sect. Of course, all of these problems would vanish into thin air if Sun Jia could advance to the immortal tier. However, Sun Jia didn't possess such talent or fortune. Li Yuan lowered his head and continued to drink wine. Huan Yun and Bai Bai didn't walk over to disturb him either, acting in a very tactful manner. After leaving the restaurant and walking to one end of the long stone arch bridge, Bai Bai smiled and said in a soft voice, "Old spiritual master, I've only just advanced to the golden core tier, so my experience is still lacking, and I'm yet to obtain an individual residence. The next time old spiritual master graces our sect with his presence, I hope that I already own some island in the Dragon Palace small world, and can warmly welcome old spiritual master. If Lady Bai manages to obtain a residence in the small world, then you can send me a letter beforehand to let me know. I'll personally pay a visit to congratulate Lady Bai," Huan Yun said with a smile. Bai Bai smiled and nodded in response, bowing to the old spiritual master of the Taoist sect and saying, "Words cannot express my gratitude." Huan Yun sighed with emotion and returned the gesture, saying, "Cultivation isn't easy, so let us both work hard. Those who form a golden core will become one of us." As long as Huan Yun didn't advance to the nascent tier, then regardless of how much older than Bai Bai he was, he would still share the same status as this young direct disciple of the water dragon sect. Bai Bai didn't show excessive humility and courtesy, and she simply bade farewell to the old spiritual master with her gaze before taking her leave. However, the young golden core tier earth immortal's feeling of gratitude came from the bottom of her heart. In reality, Bai Bai had felt slightly regretful about not discussing how to tie up the matters in advance with Huan Yun after returning to the water dragon sect. Bai Bai wouldn't have hesitated even if she needed to offer an extremely valuable gift, lest the southern sect take advantage of this opportunity to suppress not only her future at the water dragon sect, but even target her master, the sect leader. For example, vagrant cultivator Wu Lingting was a guest elder of the water dragon sect, but in reality, he was more specifically a guest elder of the northern sect. However, he had almost shifted his seat in the ancestral hall to the opposite side because of this matter. Her master had also felt incredibly frustrated. Thankfully, every cloud had a silver lining. Bai Bai had never imagined that Huan Yun would be willing to speak up for her without the two of them making a deal and reaching an agreement beforehand. Not only had he helped her in a difficult moment, helping her wash away all suspicions in the sect, but he had even provided her with icing on the cake, allowing her to become a prudent and cautious person during her training at that ruin. Regardless of whether the statements were true or false, Huan Yun had said everything that should be said to the disciplinary elder of the water dragon sect, not uttering a single word that shouldn't be said. Bai Bai had felt a little shocked after hearing this from her extremely relieved master, with a look of incredulity spreading across her face. Sun Jie hadn't said anything extra at the time, simply telling his disciple to cherish this rare display of kindness in the mountains. After learning that Huan Yun was already a guest elder of Cloudtop City, Sun Jie had no option but to warn the inexperienced Bai Bai that she should secretly make a trip to the sacred Lotus Nation if she had the chance. Afterward, she could conveniently visit Cloudtop City. In any case, City Lord Shinjunza was also a Golden Core Tier Earth Immortal. Bai Bai remembered all of these things. Thus, she had cordially invited Huan Yun, who was traveling around the Northern Pavilion Nation, to visit the Water Dragon sect. When Huan Yun learned that she had yet to obtain an island and establish her own residence, he had become quite pedantic, saying that he needed to immediately return to his mountains after traveling around outside for so long. And thus, that conversation had taken place on the bridge between the two Golden Core Tier Earth Immortals. These were interpersonal skills and worldly abilities that masters and Dao mentors wouldn't teach, nor would they explicitly try to teach. Bai Bai was given a lot to think about as she stood at the end of the bridge by herself. In the past, she had always blindly followed that golden rule in the mountains. Those who can't put down worldly matters will fail to become immortals in the mountains. Looking at it now, however, were there not a large number of cultivators like that in the mountains around her, occupying both lofty and lowly positions? By the looks of it, putting down worldly matters didn't necessarily mean ignoring them altogether, taking a lazy approach where one was a law unto oneself. Elsewhere, Li Yuan was leaning on the railing of the bridge, still roughly 50 kilometers away from reaching the end of the bridge. Even so, he was able to clearly see the figure of that young Golden Core Tier cultivator. He felt like her aptitude was actually quite good. "Young brat!" someone suddenly shouted from behind Li Yuan. Li Yuan turned around and the man from before smiled and tossed over a pot of wine, saying, "I spent my own money to purchase this pot of midnight wine, so don't go fucking wailing in the restaurant in the future. As a man, don't you find that embarrassing and unsightly?" Li Yuan smiled and hugged the pot of wine to his chest, bowing and saying loudly, "Thank you, good sir. Have a safe trip home, good sir." The man faltered upon hearing this, scolding Li Yuan with a chuckle before striding away. Li Yuan drank wine as he walked, causing his mood to improve slightly. Meanwhile, Huan Yun didn't take an immortal ship or soar on the wind, instead walking slowly along the bank of the Plenty River. He had once embarked on a journey of examining his conscience with a young man at Cloudtop City. The young man had seemingly spoken some lofty but empty principles. He had explained that some principles were like water veins, flowing slowly and helping people act in a smooth and natural manner. Some principles were like mountain roots, helping people's hearts remain stable and unmoving in a world where matters were impermanent. Both types of principles were good, but worldly matters remained difficult because these principles would often fight with each other, beating one another black and blue and causing blood to flow from their heads. In fact, they might even beat each other to death just like that. Huan Yun was able to accept Chun Pingan's words because the old spiritual master had suffered greatly at the hands of such a battle during the treasure hunting trip, which was filled with twists and turns. Was Huan Yun a good person? Of course he was. Not only was this a publicly acknowledged fact, but Huan Yun also regarded himself as a good person. Otherwise, he wouldn't have come to Cloudtop City to speak for Shinjunza, someone who had no hope of advancing to the nascent tier in his lifetime. In the end, he had even agreed to become a Dao guardian for Su Xingjiu and Zhao Qingwan. Would good people make mistakes? Of course they would. First, it was the temptation of valuable treasures, after which it was the reputation that he had accumulated over a lifetime. In fact, Huan Yun had already gone against his conscience and his heart, yearning to kill other people to snatch the treasures and safeguard his reputation. He had almost committed an unforgivable mistake. Many times it seemed like the difference of a single breath could lead to completely opposite outcomes of right and wrong, good and bad, with the chasm between these results like the gulf between heaven and earth. The bright moon hung high in the night sky. Huan Yun took a deep breath, feeling relaxed and at ease. That young sword immortal was so open-minded. So Huan Yun wondered if he also faced mental tribulations that were very difficult to overcome. If he did, then wouldn't those tribulations be like insurmountable chasms? Huan Yun could only wish that person the best, hoping that he could lay bridges over water, pave roads in the mountains, and remain unwavering amid the wind and rain at some secluded location near the water dragon sect. An old Taoist priest reached over to support the young Taoist priest beside him. The young Taoist priest carrying a sword on his back was stumbling around and close to falling, but there was a beaming smile on his face as he exclaimed in delight, "Master, how come I don't want to vomit at all today?" "That's definitely because your cultivation has advanced," the old Taoist priest replied with a serious expression. "If you return to Ground-Lying Peak now, your senior brothers and senior sisters will definitely praise you for your progress." "Master, tell me the truth," the young Taoist priest said with a skeptical expression. Only after being pressed by his disciple did the old Taoist priest reveal, "Your master has many friends after all, so even though we're traveling quickly, it's inevitable that we'll need to stop from time to time. This trip was the shortest one so far." "Master, your speaking skills are so poor, so it's no wonder that your friends in the mountain never invite you inside to sit for a while when you visit them," the young Taoist priest grumbled. "I'm able to see things clearly, and those people are so polite when they speak with Master that they don't appear like genuine friends at all. Master, if this is the same case when you travel outside the mountains in the future, then it truly won't do." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded and concurred. "Your master is indeed lacking when it comes to making friends." Zhang Shanfeng glanced at his master and didn't say anything. The old spiritual master could only nod again and add, "I'm a bit lacking when it comes to cultivation as well." Zhang Shanfeng smiled and consoled. "It's okay. Master's Dao power isn't high, and your disciple's Dao power isn't much better." Zhang Shanfeng shook his head and looked around, asking, "Master, the water dragon sect is such a large immortal force, so you don't have any friends here, do you?" Only at this place, which was the destination of their trip, did Spiritual Master Fire Dragon explicitly mention the immortal force's name, saying that Zhang Shanfeng's friend, Chan Ping'an, was most likely going to be around here for a while. As for the other lofty mountains, vast rivers, and immortal abodes that the two of them had visited before, Zhang Shanfeng wasn't familiar with those places and those people anyway, so his master naturally hadn't mentioned their names. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon faltered for a moment before smiling and nodding in response. And thus, he used his mind's lake to tell sect leader Sun Jie of the Water Dragon sect that he didn't need to show himself. He could return to the ancestral hall first. Was this disrespectful and against etiquette? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was already paying a visit, so was this not a great show of respect and etiquette? Die. Chun Ping'an entered his room and started to read the secret letter. Zhu Lian first mentioned Wei Bo's successful breakthrough, writing that he had become the first upper 5-tier mountain god in the history of the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. Emperor Song He of the Great Li Empire had personally visited the Dragon Spring Prefecture, with 2 of the 6 head ministers accompanying him, one from the Ministry of Rights and one from the Ministry of Justice. They had ascended Cloud Drape Mountain and congratulated Wei Bo. And not only that, but the Imperial Court of the Empire had also retrieved a pseudo-celestial tool possessing a strong affinity with water from the Royal Treasure Chamber to bestow upon Cloud Drape Mountain, a subjugation treasure that acted as icing on the cake. With this pseudo-celestial tool, Wei Bo would be able to more easily control the water fortune in his jurisdiction, even though he was a formal mountain god. In fact, he could even suppress all of the highest-ranking river gods in the jurisdiction of the Great Li Empire's northern mountain. From this, it could be seen that the new emperor Song He was displaying more than just courtesy to this official appointed by the late emperor. Rather, he was voluntarily offering power and influence to Cloud Drape Mountain. Right now, Wei Bo was essentially controlling the mountains and waters that represented the origin of the Imperial Song clan, along with the Great Li Empire's Ministry of Rights and Ministry of Justice. Thus, Zhu Lian told Mountain Master Chun Ping'an not to worry about selling his treasures for bargain prices. Wei Bo had caused immense commotion when breaking through, drawing all kinds of auspicious phenomena that stirred up all of the residents in the capital of the Great Li Empire. Like carp crossing a river, many noble and wealthy clans furiously surged into the newly established Dragon Province, yearning to offer incense at Cloud Drape Mountain and pay their respects to Mountain God Wei. Not only that, but the Ministry of Revenue also brought close to 100 gold essence copper coins to Cloud Drape Mountain, treating this as a gift from the Imperial Court. The other ministries also showed their sincerity in various different ways. Of course, they only dared to openly offer these gifts to Cloud-Draped Mountain after first receiving approval from the young emperor. Even the young emperor was evidently a little surprised. He had already anticipated Wei Bo's breakthrough to cause a huge stir in the imperial court and the empire, but he had surprisingly still underestimated the joyful atmosphere sweeping through the officialdom and the mortal world. In fact, this was one of the largest celebrations since the founding of the Great Li Empire. The previous time such a huge celebration had taken place was when Song Chongjing had destroyed the Lu Empire, the former overlord state of the Great Li Empire that had suppressed and abused it for a long time. It was because of this that the residents in the capital of the Great Li Empire had rushed onto the streets to celebrate. Looking even further back, one needed to open the history books from several hundred years ago, when the Great Li Empire had comprehensively broken free from its status as the Lu Empire's vassal state and become an empire in its own right. Zhu Lian wrote that if Wei Bo hosted a third-night travel banquet, he could collect half of the grain rain coins still required based on conservative estimates. Apart from this, Bejeweled Hairpin Island's Lu Chongrun had already signed a contract with them, choosing to settle down at Audiobook Ridge, where the water fortune was relatively abundant. However, the ancestral hall of her immortal force would remain at Bamboo Scroll Lake, lest she be targeted by the True Realm sect. Of course, the dozen or so direct disciples with the best cultivation aptitude would all settle down at Audiobook Ridge to cultivate, with Lu Chongrun having already hired Mahis craftsmen and mechanists to construct a residence there. According to her agreement with Downtrodden Mountain, this residence would be one with Audiobook Ridge, and unless she renewed her contract in 300 years' time, this residence would automatically become the private property of Mountain Master Chan Ping'an when she left. Even though Bejeweled Hairpin Island was leasing Audiobook Ridge for 300 years, it had only paid a deposit of 30 grain rain coins. Regarding the topic of immortal coins, Lu Chongrun had insisted that her immortal force didn't have much savings due to their businesses being too small. Taking into account the cost to move and the cost to build relationships with various different forces, paying a deposit of 30 grain rain coins was already close to emptying out her entire savings. In the end, Zhang Dafeng's buffoonery had caused Lu Chongrun to reveal a secret intimately linked to her mortal identity. This was a very pleasant surprise. This princess from a fallen nation was willing to help Downtrodden Mountain in secret, striving to regain that water residence and dragon boat. Neither of these items had been found and obtained by the luminous Vermilion Empire. If they obtained both items, then Lu Chongrun was willing to give the incredibly valuable dragon boat to Downtrodden Mountain. If they only obtained a single item, regardless of whether it was the water residence or the dragon boat, then Audiobook Ridge and Downtrodden Mountain would split the treasure 50-50. Zhu Lian hadn't agreed to this offer straight away, given that this matter pertained to the locally stationed heavy cavalry of the Great Li Empire, meaning that conflict could arise very easily. Thus, Zhu Lian asked Chan Ping'an about this matter in the letter, querying whether they should accept the offer or not. As for the new governor, Wei Li, hailing from the vassal Yellow Court Nation, and the new provincial city god hailing from Steamed Bun Mountain, where the three rivers converged, Zhu Lian didn't forget to mention these unexpected appointments to the Great Li Empire's officialdom in the letter. Zhu Lian wrote even more about the liberation rite of water and land, and the heavenly worship ceremony that had taken place at Bamboo Scroll Lake, describing everything in great detail, regardless of how large or small the matter. In fact, he even wrote about the blind old Taoist priest and his two disciples settling down at Dragon Riding Alley's Burklover shop, as well as their remarks. In addition, Zhu Lian also wrote that Lu Baixiang had recruited two new disciples, a young girl by the name of Yuan Bao, and her younger brother by the name of Jian Lai. They were both decent martial arts talents, and when Chan Ping'an returned home, he could find some time to summon the two of them to Downtrodden Mountain, where they could then record their names in the genealogical records of Downtrodden Mountain's ancestral hall. There was also some information about seeking knowledge at the Great Sui Nation's Mountain Cliff Academy. The most important information was on the last piece of paper, pertaining to the spiritual energy of the Lotus Root blessed land. Following two large sums of grain rain coins being fed into the blessed land, several critical mountain roots and water veins had been significantly fortified and nurtured. After accomplishing this, they now needed to engage in a formal dialogue with the Emperor of the Southern Garden Nation. Meanwhile, this mortal emperor was already showing signs of wanting to abdicate the throne and become a cultivator, and a new emperor would naturally need to make more concessions given the inevitable instability of his rule. However, regarding these decisions that could genuinely affect the general direction of the small blessed land, Zhu Lian hoped that Qian Ping'an could personally provide an answer. That way, he, Zheng Dafeng, and Wei Bo could follow Qian Ping'an's wishes to come up with a proper plan of attack. Apart from these major and minor matters pertaining to his mountains, Zhu Lian also mentioned many matters relating to the world outside the mountains. The Great Li Empire had promoted 2 generals of the heavy cavalry, who had competed against each other to breach the luminous Vermilion Empire first. Chao Ping and Su Gaoshan were both promoted to the position of military governor, a relatively new official position in the history of the Great Li Empire. It was always said that this position was one that the late emperor had especially created to serve as a pillar position for meritorious generals of the empire. The Chao clan was already a pillar clan to begin with, whereas Su Gaoshan now felt much more confident than before, enjoying an equal standing with the other pillar clans. It was rumored that the Great Li Empire would eventually appoint 6 military governors, with 1 in the capital, 1 at Old Dragon City, 1 in the former territory of the luminous Vermilion Empire, and 3 at undetermined locations for undetermined individuals. There was no hint of who or where these 3 military governors would come from. At the same time, turmoil was sweeping through many of the conquered nations, with people rising up and cultivators even going as far as to wantonly assassinate stationed officials of the Great Li Empire. Apart from the heavy cavalry under Chao Ping and Su Gaoshan continuing to march southward, the Third Army of Heavy Cavalry started to slow down and eventually stop, with some staying in the former territory of the luminous Vermilion Empire and some traveling north to quash the rebellions. Some big and some small, there were a total of several dozen matters mentioned in the letter. Qian Ping'an carefully read Zhu Lian's letter twice before picking up Pei Qian's letter, which only consisted of 2 pages. She was simply boasting and praising herself. She had made transcriptions earnestly, not accumulating any debt. Her self-created deranged demon sword technique was progressing in leaps and bounds, clearly becoming the most paramount technique of paramount techniques. Her relationship with Zhou Mili was also very good, and the small water monster had already become the right guardian of Dragon Riding Alley's pastry shop. Pei Qian asked Qian Ping'an whether Zhou Mili should be promoted to Downtrodden Mountain's right guardian when he returned home, but her question was giving away her guilty conscience, what with her remark that she wouldn't casually promise Zhou Mili such a high-ranking position, and that she was a very fair and just person who would remain impartial despite her good relationship with Zhou Mili. Thus, her master needed to make the final call when he returned home. She also talked about how extremely earnest Xin Yuanji was regarding her fist technique training, and this was as expected of a martial arts prodigy whom the old cook had personally picked out and brought to the mountain. However, Big Sister Xin had been concentrating far too hard when practicing fist techniques one time, so much so that she hadn't paid attention to the steps and had accidentally slipped and fallen. Pei Qian claimed that she had coincidentally been walking past at the time, yet she surprisingly hadn't managed to catch Big Sister Xin. As a result, she still felt a little guilty and uneasy even as she wrote this letter. Thus, if Big Sister Xin mentioned this matter in the future, Qian Ping'an most certainly shouldn't reprimand or punish his opening disciple. Pei Qian had definitely made this mistake by accident. Qian Ping'an immediately knew that there was much more to the story than what Pei Qian had described. She had definitely committed a punishable offense, and it was because of this that she was making an excuse for herself in the letter first. Moreover, there was another point that Pei Qian definitely hadn't noticed. She had written about many things that she had witnessed in Downtrodden Mountain, yet she hadn't made a single mention about how many silver coins the 2 shops at Dragon Riding Alley had made. In Qian Ping'an's view, she had definitely skipped a huge number of classes at the private school. Qian Ping'an didn't think much about this, especially since Zhu Lian was there to watch over Pei Qian. She most likely wouldn't go overboard, and even if she did, he believed that Zhu Lian would inform him in the letter. Even so, he would still reward Pei Qian with a good number of knuckles to the forehead when he returned to Downtrodden Mountain. She hadn't mentioned anything about her studies and academic progress in the letter, so how could this be regarded as studying in earnest? With Pei Qian's temper, would she not brag and show off if she were praised by her teachers? Pei Qian also mentioned in her letter that Big Sister Xiuxiu was no longer at Divine Elegance Mountain, and she had heard that Big Sister Xiuxiu was now cultivating somewhere else. Pei Qian felt slightly worried about big sister Xiuxiu, seeing that she hadn't visited the Berklover shop to purchase desserts for a long time already. She also wrote that a beautiful big sister called Sui Jingqing had come to the mountains, and not only was she beautiful, but she was also astonishingly generous, not even batting an eyelid when she spent money. However, she was very poised as the opening disciple of her master, never asking Sui Jingqing to buy her anything, not a single time. At the end of the letter, Pei Qian wished her master a smooth journey and bountiful wealth, hoping that he could be happy and safe every single day. She also wished that he could return home earlier. Upon reading this, Chan Ping'an felt slightly reluctant to punish her with knuckles to the forehead. An old Taoist priest and a young Taoist priest spent 2 snowflake coins at one end of the long stone arch bridge, each receiving an immortal Mandarin wood tablet. Master, is your concealment technique effective or not? Zhang Shanfeng asked in a soft voice. Why do I feel like a lot of people are still looking at us? In any case, us hailing from ground-lying peak isn't an embarrassing matter, and when I was traveling around the world back then, not a single person could tell I was from ground-lying peak. In fact, no one mistakenly thought I was from Peach Mountain, the secret profound mountain, or the other mountains of my senior brothers either. Following Master's instructions, I only told people that I was an external heavenly master from the Middle-earth divine continents Mount Longhu. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled faintly and replied, That's presumably because the mountains of your senior brothers aren't very famous. Zhang Shanfeng sighed and said, I feel like my senior brothers have fairly lofty Dao power. You climb the mountains slowly each time, and descend the mountains in reluctance and discomfort. Yet, you're still able to appraise the Dao power of your senior brothers. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked with a smile. Zhang Shanfeng nodded in earnest, lowering his voice and replying, I've heard the juniors in the mountains mention this a few times, saying that the senior brothers and senior sisters who are able to establish their own mountains all possess terrifyingly high cultivation bases. How high? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked with a chuckle. Zhang Shanfeng shook his head and replied, There isn't a consensus regarding this. Some say they're Golden Core tier Earth Immortals, while some say they're at least Dragon Gate tier Immortals. He paused for a moment before continuing in a solemn voice, Master, even though we're not allowed to casually talk about cultivation bases at ground-lying peak, the juniors are still young, so they're only having casual conversations about this due to their innocence. Master isn't allowed to take this too seriously and scold them when he gets back. Otherwise, how can I continue to cultivate at ground-lying peak in the future? Won't the juniors all criticize me behind my back, saying that their junior uncle is a senior who likes to gossip and spread rumors? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and nodded in response. Zhang Shanfeng was still worried, so he pressed, You need to give me a firm response, Master. Otherwise, I'll still feel unconvinced. He couldn't help but feel anxious. Ever since he was old enough to remember things, he had only seen his master get angry one time. Back then, for some unknown reason, a senior brother who was strong enough to leave ground-lying peak and establish his own mountain had gotten into an argument with another senior brother who was still cultivating at ground-lying peak. Perhaps they had failed to work through their differences through reason alone. So the senior brother who had established his own mountain had ended up making a remark about his higher cultivation base. In reality, the senior brother who had still been cultivating at ground-lying peak hadn't thought much about this remark at all. Unexpectedly, however, their master, who had already been sleeping for 2 or 3 years, had suddenly stood up from amid the large pile of snow atop the mountain peak, shaking off the snow on his body and leaving ground-lying peak in a flash. Zhang Shanfeng had still been a young child at the time, and he had been busy partaking in a snow fight with several other young Taoist priests the same age as him. They had exchanged glances with each other following their master's departure, after which they had continued to have fun. After all, their master's presence or absence wouldn't delay their games and enjoyment, especially since snow was very rare on ground-lying peak. Indeed, it could only snow when their master was asleep, so the young Taoist priests would be even happier about this than the new year. Only afterward had Zhang Shanfeng heard about his senior brother, who had uttered a single wrong remark, being expelled from the immortal force on the same day. That senior brother had kneeled for an entire month near the perimeter of ground-lying peak, also kowtowing for 1 entire month. Even so, their master still hadn't changed his mind. The other senior brothers had all gathered at ground-lying peak, But no one had dared to say anything, all standing there as if they had made mistakes equally as serious as that expelled disciple. Perhaps because Zhang Shanfeng was the youngest disciple at the time, he was the only one who had dared to ask about this matter, especially since he was very curious about why their master had become so angry. After all of the other disciples left Ground Lying Peak, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had said two things to Zhang Shanfeng. There is no such thing as an unintentional remark in this world, only intentional remarks that have accidentally been spoken aloud. This doesn't matter for those outside the mountains, but it's a fatal flaw for those in the mountains. Either a cultivator will lose their own life one day, or they'll cause the deaths of even more mortals outside the mountains. Zhang Shanfeng had still wanted to plead for his senior brother, but Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had simply shaken his head and patted the little Taoist priest's head, saying that the matter was already closed. Since his senior brother had finished his journey in the mountains, it was better that he focused on cultivating his heart outside the mountains. Back to the present, the old spiritual master stood on the stone arch bridge and had no choice but to promise. "All right, I'll pretend that I didn't hear anything." As they walked along the long bridge, Zhang Shanfeng noticed a clever-looking young man in yellow standing not far in front of them with an adrift expression, seemingly looking at him and his master. The young man then turned around and ran away, vanishing in the blink of an eye. "Master, what's this all about?" Zhang Shanfeng asked in puzzlement. "We've come across each other and had some interactions before," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon replied with a smile. Meanwhile, cold sweat had formed on Li Yuan's forehead as he continued to furiously sprint away. Come across each other? Come across his fucking ass. He was the lofty water official of the Plenty River, yet Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had used a water element immortal technique to suppress him at the bottom of the large river for an entire month back then. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon furrowed his brows and looked back. Behind them was sect leader Sun Jie, who was also using a concealment technique. Sun Jie mustered his courage and quickly walked forward. He had no other option. If this old spiritual master were truly just passing by the Water Dragon sect, then so be it if he didn't show himself after receiving the spiritual master's instructions. However, the old spiritual master was clearly heading to the Dragon Palace Small World, so it would be incompatible with etiquette for Sun Jie to stay at the ancestral hall. Even if Sun Jie were directly scolded by the old spiritual master, that would still be better than the Water Dragon sect going against etiquette and showing disrespect. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon wasn't very happy about having to socialize with more people, but Sun Jie was the sect leader of the Water Dragon sect, after all, so he naturally couldn't reciprocate Sun Jie's smile with violence. With this in mind, he smiled and said, "I'm here to sightsee with my disciple." At the same time, he used his mind's lake to clearly tell Sun Jie, "Sect leader Sun, this disciple of mine isn't very familiar with the matters in the mountains, so please help me conceal these matters from him." Sun Jie instantly understood, and he bowed and greeted with a smile, "My respects to Spiritual Master." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and nodded in acknowledgement. Zhang Shanfeng was at a complete loss, not even knowing how to respectfully address the sect leader. In the end, he could only bow and say, "Junior Zhang Shanfeng pays his respects to Senior." Sun Jie hurriedly returned the gesture. This young Taoist priest was Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's direct disciple, after all, so he was worthy of an individual greeting from the sect leader of the Water Dragon sect. This caused Zhang Shanfeng to feel slightly flustered, and the young Taoist priest immediately responded with another bow. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon felt slightly exasperated. Sun Jie felt like things were becoming slightly farcical, so he pushed aside the pedantic matters of etiquette and said that he was going to accompany the spiritual master for a short while. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon almost always traveled alone when he left the mountains to wander around the world, seldom ever bringing any disciples with him. Regardless of whether it was the profound Dawn Primordial Lord, who had unfortunately passed away, or those founding disciples of the Peach Mountain branch, the secret Profound branch or the other branches, it was said that none of these impressively powerful disciples had ever traveled around the world with the old spiritual master who was extremely fond of sleeping. In reality, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had only sought out Zhang Shanfeng during the second half of the young Taoist priest's multi-year journey, when he had already traveled south to another continent. Afterward, they had traveled around the Middle-earth Divine Continent and the Southern World Continent together. Before that, Zhang Shanfeng had traveled by himself for a long time, even if this meant camping in the wilderness and suffering from starvation. He had described this as tempering his Dao power, but in reality, he had endured all kinds of hardships and sorrows. Sun Jie accompanied spiritual master Fire Dragon and Zhang Shanfeng to the restaurant on the bridge before bidding farewell and taking his leave. As they walked, it was Zhang Shanfeng who had chatted with Sun Jie the entire time, most likely afraid that his master was poor at handling these kinds of interactions. It was only when Sun Jie was about to turn around and leave that spiritual master Fire Dragon finally opened his mouth and said, "I'll help put in a word to Li Yuan for you." Sun Jie was just about to bow in gratitude. Spiritual master Fire Dragon waved a hand and said, "There's no need to thank me." After the relatively respectful senior walked far away, Zhang Shanfeng asked in a quiet voice, "Why did you ignore him the entire time, master?" Spiritual master Fire Dragon smiled and replied, "He's not a friend, so there wasn't anything to chat about with him. Friends aren't made through casual chatter either." There was a look of reminiscence on spiritual master Fire Dragon's face. Did he not have any friends? Of course he had friends, and quite a lot of friends at that. However, it was a shame that these people were no longer in the world. After living for too long, it was as if he could only bid farewell to his friends, one after another. He could bid farewell to some of them in person, but unfortunately not all of them. No matter what, he would feel mournful regardless of whether it was the former or the latter. This had nothing to do with the level of his Dao power. Thus, it was very good that this disciple of his could become acquainted with Chen Ping'an, who liked to speak reason, and Su Yuanxia, who liked to write travel journals. It was even better that both Zhang Shanfeng and Chen Ping'an sincerely respected that big-bearded martial artist. With minds alike and hardships tackled together, even drinking water could feel better than drinking wine. There existed some enviable brotherhoods where blades would be hidden behind the veil of brotherly affection. On the flip side, there existed some seemingly ordinary relationships where friends would arrive with helping hands during times of dire need. After providing help, they would cup their fists and bid farewell, saying that their help was only a minor matter. There were still 17 kilometers until they arrived at the city gates leading to the Plenty River summer residence. And Zhang Shanfeng asked, "Master, how did you calculate the location of Chen Ping'an?" "This was a very difficult matter," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon replied. "However, there's a very strong link between you and Chen Ping'an, for example, that Heavenly Master Seal and the ancient sword that you're currently carrying on your back. Both of these items were obtained by Chen Ping'an first, after which he gifted these fated opportunities to you. It's thanks to this that I was able to track down his location. Moreover, Chen Ping'an is coincidentally in the northern complete reed continent as well. Otherwise, it would have been even harder for me to calculate his position if he were in some other continent." In reality, there was another secret that Spiritual Master Fire Dragon didn't explain to Zhang Shanfeng. During their encounter with Chen Ping'an in an alley of that small village in the southeastern region of the Eastern Treasured Vial continent, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had given Chen Ping'an a greeting gift, helping to slightly stabilize that child's future journey on the path of martial arts. However, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon didn't mention this matter, because this small gift wasn't something that was worth discussing. When they arrived at the entrance of the small world and heard that they needed to pay 2 lesser heat coins to enter, Zhang Shanfeng immediately felt like the Water Dragon sect was quite dirty and ruthless. He gritted his teeth and hesitantly retrieved 2 lesser heat coins from his sleeve, handing them to the gatekeeper from the Water Dragon sect. Zhang Shanfeng ran his hand across one of the door studs on the large red gates as he entered, not forgetting to turn around and say to the old spiritual master, "Master, do you want to touch them as well? Chen Ping'an told me about some customs of different areas before, and one custom mentioned that climbing the city walls can shoo away all kinds of sickness, while touching the door studs of city gates can chase away filth and bad luck." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and shook his head, saying, "I'll pass." After walking through the city gate and seeing the 9,999 jade white steps, Zhang Shanfeng instantly remarked with emotion, "Impressive, how truly magnificent. As expected of a sect-level immortal force." In comparison, Ground-Lying Peak only had a small and winding mountain path snaking up the mountain, with weeds decorating the path and wild fruits aplenty. Before leaving the mountain to travel around the outside world, Zhang Shanfeng had often scoured the mountain with a large group of little Taoist priests, returning with bountiful yields of wild fruits each time. Upon arriving at the mountain peak and seeing the 16 dragon walls underfoot, Zhang Shanfeng became increasingly convinced that the water dragon sect was incredibly wealthy. Thinking that he had contributed at least 2 lesser heat coins to the immortal aura of the water dragon sect, Zhang Shanfeng couldn't help but feel a little happy. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and asked, "Do you feel like these extravagant mountains still can't compare to our own ordinary mountain?" Zhang Shanfeng nodded and replied, "Of course. We'll return home after we meet Chen Ping'an." The 16 snow-white flood dragons soared into the sea of clouds, making their way toward the Dragon Palace small world. Inside a room on Paddling Island, Chen Ping'an closed his eyes and rested his mind, pondering for a long time before retrieving a calligraphy brush and ink, placing a piece of paper on the table, and starting to compose a reply letter. The Lotus Root Blessed Land was quite a good name, so he decided to keep this name going forward. This blessed land would become a medium-level blessed land after it was fed enough immortal coins, and in the meantime, they could continue to secretly scout locations and choose sites for those future mountain god shrines and water god shrines. However, Downtrodden Mountain was in no hurry to sign any contracts with the Emperor of the Southern Garden Nation, and this was something that could wait until Chen Ping'an returned home first. At that time, he would personally visit the Blessed Land to deal with these matters. Before Chen Ping'an returned, Zhu Lian simply needed to delay things regardless of how good an offer the Emperor of the Southern Garden Nation proposed. Weibo breaking through to the upper 5 tiers was brilliant news, and everyone in Downtrodden Mountain needed to prepare a congratulatory gift for the formal mountain god. The gift from Chen Ping'an needed to be an immortal treasure from the mountains, and he could temporarily borrow such a treasure from Zhang Shangzhen of the True Realm sect. If Zhu Lian felt like it was appropriate, he could even agree to Zhang Shangzhen becoming a guest elder of Downtrodden Mountain, given that he used the pseudonym Zhou Fei and disguised himself as a nascent tier cultivator. Additionally, there would be a requirement for Zhang Shangzhen to hand over 1 immortal treasure. As for Pei Qian and the other juniors, it didn't matter if their congratulatory gifts were slightly less valuable. For example, Pei Qian could simply write an auspicious couplet. Of course, it would be even better if Pei Qian decided to put in some more thought and effort. Regarding the matters with Lu Chongrun, Zhu Lian could employ Lu Baixiang's help to secretly look for the water residents and dragon boat. This would be the best course of action. Before doing this, however, they needed to first inform Cui Dongshan and wait for his explicit response. Only after receiving his affirmation should Zhu Lian and Lu Baixiang leave the Great Li Empire. If Cui Dongshan felt that this matter shouldn't be pursued, then Zhu Lian should directly turn down Lu Chongruan's request. Not only that, but Zhu Lian should even warn her to comprehensively give up on this matter. And it wouldn't matter even if he spoke more harshly. They were neighbors in the mountains now, so even though some hard truths would sound grating and unpleasant to the ears, it was one matter whether they were heeded or not, and it was another matter whether they were honestly voiced or not. After writing this, Chen Ping'an paused his calligraphy brush for a moment before continuing to compose the remainder of the letter. If Cui Dongshan told them not to pursue the matter, yet Lu Chongrun still insisted on taking the risk, then Downtrodden Mountain could only rescind its lease of Aoback Ridge. At that time, Downtrodden Mountain would happily pay the compensation for tearing up the contract. Rather than being implicated by the cultivators from Bejeweled Hairpin Island and facing undeserved calamity, it would be better off to sever their ties nice and early. If Downtrodden Mountain wanted to achieve longevity and success, with a steady stream of income all the while, then it was inevitable that it would need to make some sacrifices and trade-offs. Parting ways early on would be better than a continually deteriorating relationship that ultimately transformed from friendship into resentment and animosity. If Lu Chongrun refused to heed their suggestion, it would be better for Downtrodden Mountain to suffer some short-term complaints from Bejeweled Hairpin Island, which would have traveled all the way to the Dragon Spring Prefecture for nothing. If things truly came to that, Downtrodden Mountain would also need to provide some additional compensation in secret. For example, giving a heads-up to Zhang Shangzhen and Guan Yiran, and asking them to look after Bamboo Scroll Lake's Bejeweled Hairpin Island. There would be no need to inform Lu Chongrun about these matters. As for the favor that Downtrodden Mountain would owe Zhang Shangzhen and Guan Yiran, it would consider these matters when Chen Ping'an returned to the Eastern Treasured Vile Continent. As for Dong Shuijing, Downtrodden Mountain would do its best to actively help him, as long as it didn't pertain to any significant matter of principle. There was no need to consider any gains or losses. However, the help rendered to Dong Shuijing definitely couldn't harm the interests of General Guan Yiran, who was overseeing Pond Water City. This required careful consideration and balancing from Zhu Lian. Regarding Dong Shuijing's personal relationships with Prefectural Overseer Yuan and Kiln Supervision Official Chao, Downtrodden Mountain wouldn't become involved in these relationships at all. However, Downtrodden Mountain could have frequent interactions with the newly appointed Governor Wei Li, who had previously been a prefectural overseer of the Yellow Court Nation. It was worth building a relationship with him, and Zhu Lian could make a call on how to manage this. In addition, there was also the new provincial city god who had seemingly appeared from out of nowhere. Since the incense person of this city god was already acquainted with Pei Qian, Zhu Lian could give her some subtle hints and suggest that she treat the incense person the same as always. Apart from this, Downtrodden Mountain needed to have some interactions with this provincial city god, but only just enough, with a shallow relationship being preferable to an intimate one. After all, this deity definitely had a very complicated background, seeing that he was able to rise from a measly mountain lord to a provincial city god in a single leap. Downtrodden Mountain was seeking stability right now, doing its best to avoid being dragged into the conflicts between some immortals in the imperial court of the Great Li Empire. The core of the Great Li Empire was definitely experiencing unpredictable waves and dangerous currents right now. Regarding Old Dragon City's Fan Air and Sun Jiaoshu, Chen Ping'an asked Zhu Lian to personally pay a visit when he had spare time, representing Chen Ping'an to visit and express gratitude. During this time, Zhu Lian also needed to visit Osmanthus Island's Lady Gui if she weren't traveling around another continent. Of course, there was also Sword Cultivator Ma Ji, the Golden Courtier guest elder of the Fan clan, to whom Zhu Lian could gift some wine. He could dig out 2 pots of immortal wine that were buried near the bamboo building. Downtrodden Mountain didn't need to pay any heed to the True Realm Sect's guest elder Lu Jimao advancing to the unpolished jade tier. There was definitely no need to offer any gifts or congratulations. They should also continue to make use of proxies to secretly gather any and all information pertaining to Sunscorch Mountain and Light Breeze City's Su clan. Apart from these matters, Chen Ping'an wrote about another 20 or so major and minor matters in the secret letter, simply telling Zhu Lian to act based on his own judgment for the large majority of them. Chen Ping'an was simply giving Zhu Lian a reminder, listing out the matters that still needed to be addressed. There were also some matters that Chen Ping'an had already made decisions on, but if Zhu Lian and the others felt like the direction was incorrect and required further discussion, then they could write a letter and send it to Li Lu. Chen Ping'an would definitely visit Lion Peak before returning to the eastern treasured Vile continent. Finally, Chen Ping'an didn't write a separate letter addressed to Pei Qian, but at the end of the letter, he told her to exchange more letters with big sister Baoping. At the same time, she needed to visit Chen Rushu, Chen Lingjun, and of course, Zhou Mili and shopkeeper Shiro at Dragon Riding Alley to inform them that her master was safe and sound. He also nagged a bit, telling Pei Qian not to misbehave at school. If she felt like her teachers were bad at teaching, then she could at least learn from them how to conduct herself as a person. If she felt like her teachers had mediocre conduct, then she could simply learn from them the sagely principles in the scriptures. At the very end of the letter, Chen Ping'an approved Pei Qian's request, heeding the strong recommendation of his opening disciple to formally promote Mute Lake's great water monster Zhou Mili to the position of Downtrodden Mountain's right guardian. At the same time, he gave Pei Qian permission to personally announce this promotion to Downtrodden Mountain. As his calligraphy brush nimbly glided over the paper, Chen Ping'an was unaware that there was a wide smile on his face and a gentle look in his eyes. After finishing the letter, Chen Ping'an leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers behind his head, closing his eyes and recalling the little lotus spirit who was apparently still not fond of appearing in front of other people. When spring arrived and flowers bloomed, would the trees and flowers on the 2 sides of the mountain path in his hometown grow even more lush than the previous year? The Dragon Palace Small World would always experience heavy rain following the conclusion of a gold edict ceremony. Chen Ping'an put away the letter and walked out of his room, opening the oil paper umbrella and continuing his habit of strolling around outside whenever it rained. He planned to hand the letter to Li Yuan after he finished this stroll, asking him to deliver it to Downtrodden Mountain. Walking on the small bluestone path that snaked past the mountains and waters on Paddling Island, Qian Ping'an suddenly looked toward a certain direction, where he was able to vaguely make out a talismanic boat slowly drifting over. Apart from Li Yuan and Lady Shenlin of the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, he wasn't acquainted with anyone else in the Dragon Palace small world. The talismanic boat suddenly became as quick as a flying sword, gently landing on the lake before steadily docking at the shore. Qian Ping'an focused his gaze and rubbed his eyes, making sure that he wasn't seeing things wrong. Qian Ping'an hurriedly used the mountain's green rain-like mist jade tablet to deactivate the formation around Paddling Island. Meanwhile, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had already removed the concealment technique on himself and his disciple, with Zhang Shanfeng laughing heartily and exclaiming, "Qian Ping'an." Qian Ping'an smiled and asked, "What brings you here?" "I was planning to look for you at Ground Lying Peak after I finished wandering around the Plenty River." Zhang Shanfeng strode forward toward Qian Ping'an. Qian Ping'an handed his oil paper umbrella to Zhang Shanfeng before bowing and cupping his fists in respect, greeting, "Junior Qian Ping'an pays his respects to old Spiritual Master." "No, I'm not old at all. You can just call me Spiritual Master." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and nodded in acknowledgement at the young man, causing the rain at Paddling Island to immediately stop the instant that he stepped down from the talismanic boat. Zhang Shanfeng faltered for a moment before closing the oil paper umbrella, chuckling in delight. What an auspicious sign! He then gestured at Qian Ping'an's height, asking in puzzlement, "How are you growing tall so quickly, Qian Ping'an?" As it turned out, Qian Ping'an was already an entire fist taller than the young Taoist priest now. In reality, many years had already passed since their last meeting. Qian Ping'an felt slightly awkward at this moment. It naturally wasn't an issue if he were alone at Paddling Island, and it would also be fine if Zhang Shanfeng were the only visitor. He wouldn't need to be overly polite. However, the old spiritual master was also present now, and this made things slightly more troublesome. Qian Ping'an had wine, but it was clearly inappropriate to offer this to the old spiritual master. He also had specialty tea from the Rainbow Sparrow residence, but it was a pity that he was absolutely no good at brewing tea, nor did he have the required tea brewing equipment. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon looked Qian Ping'an up and down before asking in amusement, "You're walking with a crippled leg. You're facing some troubles, aren't you?" Qian Ping'an nodded with a bitter smile. Zhang Shanfeng used his elbow to lightly nudge Qian Ping'an under the watchful gaze of the old spiritual master, and Qian Ping'an repaid the favor straight away, with the two of them engaging in a light-hearted back and forth. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon paid no heed to this as he slowly walked forward. The two young men walked beside him. "That scholarly core was so good, and it also possessed a strong affinity with your great Tao, so how did it disappear just like that?" the old spiritual master asked. "Otherwise, if you had 3 items of the metal element, water element, and earth element supporting you, you wouldn't need to ascend the mountain like a cripple as you're doing right now." After hearing this, Zhang Shanfeng immediately stopped greeting Qian Ping'an with his elbow. "I came across some matters and I was unable to persuade myself to act against my conscience," Qian Ping'an replied. "When it comes to some principles, we can't be hypocritical and only use them to constrain other people." The old spiritual master smiled and asked, "I'm quite curious now. What principle requires such a huge sacrifice to uphold?" Qian Ping'an hesitated for a moment before giving a vague answer, replying, "I came across a person whom I would ordinarily kill 1,000 times over, but I couldn't bring myself to kill this person no matter what." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded and remarked, "With the scholarly core shattering, the aura of virtue that you worked so hard to accumulate has now collapsed and dispersed. And then? What now? When will this end?" Qian Ping'an remained silent. The old spiritual master smiled and continued, "You can drink some wine and give me an answer after you've had some time to think this through carefully." Hearing this, Qian Ping'an grabbed his sword nurturing gourd, which was filled with rice wine from his hometown, taking a small sip before offering it to Zhang Shanfeng. The young Taoist priest signaled with his eyes, reminding Qian Ping'an that his master was still present. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon continued, "Why are you acting so selfishly regarding this matter? Why couldn't you bring yourself to kill that person no matter what? Since that's the case, then I surmise your scholarly core would have shattered even if you hadn't chosen to shatter it yourself." Chen Ping'an took another sip of wine. The old spiritual master smiled and extended a hand, asking, "Did you rack your brains and use all of your abilities and a mishmash of knowledge to just barely make it until today? For example, you used the Buddhist sex subduing technique to make a certain mental demon insubstantial and confine it in your heart, while you regarded that death-deserving person as a distracting thought and confined them at some tangible location. As for how to correct this mistake, this is a far more complicated process. You've taken the legalist laws, the foreteller's rulers, the Buddhist sex salvation, and the Taoist sex fasting and tried your best to combine them together with the Confucian sex rules and regulations, forming several tangible methods of rectifying past mistakes. Is that right? You hope that one day, you and that person can identify and rectify your mistakes, day after day and year after year, allowing you to ultimately compensate the world. If you make a mistake, then you'll offer greater compensation, and as time goes on, you'll eventually be able to feel slightly more at ease. Am I right?" Chen Ping'an's expression was downcast as he tightly gripped the sword-nurturing gourd in his hand. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded, after which he shook his head and sighed with emotion. "Just how difficult will this be?" Zhang Shanfeng didn't dare to say anything, not even daring to breathe too loudly. The old spiritual master smiled and asked, "Have you thought about what the critical point is for this process of examining the heart?" He then answered his own question, continuing, "It's whether you kill another person first before killing yourself, or whether you kill yourself first before thinking about killing another person." Chen Ping'an was dazed and out of sorts as he murmured, "How can we discuss other matters before we even determine what's right and what's wrong?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon snickered and replied, "Then let me ask you this. Why is this specific person spared death by your fists and swords when they stand in front of you?" Chen Ping'an was rendered speechless. The old spiritual master smiled and continued, "Because you knew that developing killing intent would be the same as killing yourself. You would already be as good as dead before you killed that person." Chen Ping'an, is this very difficult to understand? You're far too clever, Chen Ping'an, and your understanding of the human heart far surpasses that of those the same age as you. There are many subconscious choices that you make completely in line with your conscience and true self, having absolutely nothing to do with some of those principles that you admire and value. Those are the most fundamental thoughts and perceptions hidden in the depths of your heart, and there's no need for you to perform any mental manipulation. As such, you might be seemingly unaware of these fundamental thoughts and perceptions, yet they're actually the most tangible and real. Zhang Shanfeng found this extremely difficult to understand as he stood beside them and listened on. He also felt a bit sad. The young Taoist priest initially thought that this long-awaited reunion would be a joyful occasion. He hadn't expected there to be such upsetting conversations. Zhang Shanfeng regretted his decision to bring his master to Paddling Island. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon shook his head and remarked, "In your eyes, Chen Ping'an, killing that person would essentially be the same as killing all of your past experiences, your childhood, your teenage years, and your journeys around the continents. All of the people whom you're acquainted with and are acquainted with you, especially those who have already departed from this world, will seemingly die as well. At the end of the day, are your actions truly not being influenced by your selfishness, Chen Ping'an? You're far too afraid of death. Afraid of actual death, and even more afraid of becoming dead in the eyes of other people." Chen Ping'an stood still, with the sword-nurturing gourd slipping out of his hand and lightly falling to the ground. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon turned to Zhang Shanfeng and said with a smile, "Let's continue to wander around. We'll give Chen Ping'an some time to have a good think. There's no hurry." Zhang Shanfeng was feeling incredibly anxious. However, the old spiritual master shook his head, so Zhang Shanfeng could only tightly grip the oil paper umbrella that Chen Ping'an had given him, accompanying his master to stroll elsewhere. After walking far away, the extremely worried Zhang Shanfeng turned around and gazed into the distance, asking in a quiet voice, "Master, is it truly okay to leave Chen Ping'an there by himself? When has Chen Ping'an not been by himself?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon retorted in a calm voice. Zhang Shanfeng was taken aback. The old spiritual master smiled and continued, "This is not to say that Chen Ping'an's friendship with you is insincere. Rather, this young lad has already grown accustomed to this from a young age. Is that a bad thing?" Zhang Shanfeng asked. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon thought for a moment before replying, It's naturally not a bad thing, seeing that Chan Ping'an has managed to make it until today. However, if he stays this way even after today, then it will become a bad thing? Zhang Shanfeng asked again. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon unexpectedly shook his head and said with a smile, "It will be even better. However, there's still a slight gap, and only if he fails to clearly understand this and overcome that barrier will it become a bad thing. Regarding this matter, it will become a huge calamity if he fails to comprehend it and acknowledge it. It will become his greatest mental demon. The heart's barrier was like death's door, and if one paced back and forth in this area, there would only be a fine line separating life from death. Thus, there were always cases of humans in the Yin world and ghosts in the Yang world, with humans and ghosts becoming difficult to differentiate. Things were relatively simple for mortal humans, who sought nothing more than staying alive and living better. There was no firm notion regarding ghosts and humans. On the other hand, cultivators suffering from muddy hearts would also suffer delays in their cultivation. Zhang Shanfeng scratched his head and said, "Master, I truly don't understand these complicated and roundabout matters." "Because you don't need to understand," the old spiritual master responded with a smile. "The difference between people is like the difference between two worlds. Master, I can't say much if you accuse other people of being selfish, but I feel like it's incorrect for you to call Chan Ping'an selfish," Zhang Shanfeng said. The old spiritual master shook his head and explained, "This is not a derogatory remark, so there's no need to defend Chan Ping'an and speak up for him." Zhang Shanfeng suddenly stopped and said, "Master, I'm not going to walk any further. I'm going to stay here and watch over Chan Ping'an. Otherwise, I won't feel at ease." "Very good," the old spiritual master said with a nod. "What's good about this?" Zhang Shanfeng grumbled. The old spiritual master smiled and continued walking forward by himself. He was going to take a stroll around the perimeter of the island. In any case, he was very curious about what that young man's eventual answer was going to be. Zhang Shanfeng squatted down on the spot. It wasn't raining at the moment, but he still opened the oil paper umbrella out of boredom, gazing at that minuscule figure standing near the shore in the distance. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon continued to walk forward at a slow pace. However, the perimeter of Paddling Island only measured 15 kilometers, so it wasn't long before he arrived near Chan Ping'an and gazed at the lake together with the young man. There was no rain at Paddling Island, yet heavy downpours were sweeping across all of the other islands in the Dragon Palace small world. The night sky and the curtain of rain knitted together, blending in with the lake and causing their vision to become increasingly hazy. "Old spiritual master, there's a matter that I've never revealed to anyone else," Chan Ping'an said slowly. "Feel free to speak your mind," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said. Chan Ping'an took a deep breath and revealed, "I've been to quite a lot of places in my lifetime, but looking back now, I feel like the greatest trial I faced was coincidentally during the most peaceful and stable part of my journey. It wasn't at my hometown where I was nearly killed by the mountain-moving ape, nor was it my interactions with Branch Master Lu of the Heavenly World. In fact, it wasn't even the time when my abdomen was destroyed by the sword-devouring ark, nor was it any of the myriad schemes and deadly battles. The person accompanying me during that extremely uneasy time was actually one of the people whom I respect the most. His name is Aoyang and he's a swordsman. A frightened child has no option but to fear the worst when facing an unfamiliar world," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said calmly. However, only afterward did the child realize that his mental state was actually so fragile. The more profound Aoyang's sword techniques are and the loftier his character is, able to contain heaven and earth, the more the grown-up child will feel dejected and guilty in the future. The mental state of the child was completely different from how he viewed Mr. Qi, whom he had treated like a paramount individual from the very beginning. "Feel free to keep going," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said. "I'll forget what you said afterward. The rainwater has washed heaven and earth clean, so you should seize this opportunity to boldly examine your conscience." It was only afterward that I learned that relationships and marriages in the world can also be influenced by those at the pinnacle of the mountains, Chan Ping'an continued. "After realizing this, I was very afraid that the girl whom I like doesn't actually like me of her own accord. I was very afraid of this." There was a slight smile on Chan Ping'an's face after he said this, and he continued, "But after mulling over this for a while, I felt like this wouldn't be the case. She's Ning Yao, after all, the only Ning Yao in hundreds upon thousands of years. As such, there's no such thing as what if. What else? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked with a chuckle. I'm very afraid that I'll become like the snotty little kid, transforming into the type of person whom I used to detest the most, Chen Ping'an revealed. With this in mind, I've always been afraid of becoming a cultivator in the mountains. In the beginning, I would feel deep admiration when I came across sword immortals, but after traveling far and wide and witnessing the myriad of pain and suffering in the world, I grew increasingly loath of those so-called magnificent feats, where cultivators used their swords to slice off a mountain peak or used their fists to annihilate a city. However, I came to a realization afterward, understanding that there was no need to be afraid of these matters. If my cultivation of strength reaches a pinnacle level, with my cultivation of the heart also keeping up, then I can force those cultivators in the mountains who seek nothing but satisfaction to suffer nothing but dissatisfaction. That will make me feel satisfied. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon clicked his tongue in wonder and commented, "This is the first time this old spiritual master is hearing something interesting like this. Not bad, not bad." Chen Ping'an smiled and continued, "I need to thank old spiritual master for giving me a hint regarding my examination of the heart, forcing me to admit my selfishness. Before this, I always liked to purposely consider the complexities of the world as even deeper and more chaotic. For me, I subconsciously felt like I didn't need to think any deeper regarding the destruction of my scholarly core. In reality, this was a form of evasion, and just like old spiritual master said, this was caused by my selfishness. Having a strong sense of selfishness isn't terrifying, and what's terrifying is being unaware of this selfishness while acting under its influence. There's actually no need to be afraid of it after acknowledging its presence. Once a matter has already reached rock bottom, it can still be turned around regardless of how difficult the process is, as long as one can still find the motivation and drive. This still isn't enough, the old spiritual master said with a shake of his head. I'm very good at bearing grudges, and there are many people whom I want to kill but aren't able to kill. I can only endure this for the moment. I'm not afraid of waiting, and what I'm afraid of is my principles changing after waiting for too long, resulting in me losing my reason to kill those people. Because of this, I've always yearned to grow powerful enough to kill those people before I discover any new principles. Chen Ping'an pondered for a moment before admitting, also, I've always been a cowardly person. I was afraid of ghosts when I was little, and after my parents passed away I wasn't genuinely afraid of ghosts, but I was instead using this as an excuse to avoid reality. My best friend, Lu Xianying, was aware of my biggest fear when I worked as an apprentice in the Dragon Kills. I was most afraid of falling sick. I was yet to practice fist techniques at that time, and I was even further away from starting qi refinement. In reality, however, I had already started to exert a lot of effort in trying to understand the small world that's our body. This pertained to the cycle of the 4 seasons and the transitions between the solar terms, and I had already attempted to link together heaven and earth and the human body. This was why Lu Xianying had described me as having the life of a poor maidservant, yet having the thoughts of a wealthy young mistress. I didn't only become cautious after leaving my hometown, but I actually started to disguise myself from a very young age for the sake of seeking justice and exacting revenge for my parents. I needed to become a mature and grateful child, making everyone feel like I was a person who, at the very least, wouldn't cause any trouble for them. I wouldn't steal or rob, and I definitely wouldn't become a troublemaker in the area around Clay Vase Alley. I wouldn't become a so-called seed of disaster like those old people described me. I disguised myself because I understood that I would definitely die once I lost some certain protections. Even though I was still little at the time, only just starting to understand the world, I had already learned how to please the people around me. I would often stare at the medicine pot, which I no longer needed to use in a daze, and after staring at it for a long time, I understood that it was necessary for me to learn how to strike a fine balance. Thus, I would secretly sweep the accumulated snow in the streets and alleys during winter, knowing that people wouldn't notice it after one time or a few times, but someone would definitely notice it after a dozen times or several dozen times. I would help the elderly residents draw water. I would help other children retrieve their paper kites from the trees. I would provide some minor assistance during weddings and funerals, and I would also help as much as I could in the fields. I couldn't let other people feel like Clay Vase Alley's Chen Ping'an was only doing these things because he was smart and had already thought this far. Rather, I wanted them to believe that the child from Clay Vase Alley was most likely a genuine good person. I was always doing these things before I went to the Dragon Kills to become an apprentice, with my habits becoming second nature. Things stayed the same after I became an apprentice, and even until today, having journeyed to the northern complete reed continent's paddling island, I still can't help but ponder. Just what kind of person is Chan Ping'an? Am I truly a good person? When observing a night trial at a city god temple before, the city god said there would be no rewards for meritorious acts made purely with the intention of accumulating good karma, something that made me feel very guilty. Regarding the liberation rite of water and land and the heavenly worship ceremony at Bamboo Scroll Lake, as well as the Gold Edict ceremony recently hosted at the Dragon Palace Small World, I actually felt even guiltier when I heard Li Yuan's remark about the heavens being able to detect this and ghosts and deities being able to connect with this. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon patiently finished listening to the young man's long-winded reflection before asking, "Then let me ask you this, Chan Ping'an. Do you feel like there are any justified people or matters?" Chan Ping'an nodded and replied, "Of course. For example, my parents are both good people, and I'll only ever like Ning Yao in this lifetime. I'm definitely going to witness more of the world's scenery for the sake of Mr. Qi, and I'm going to become a swordsman who's like Aoyang. I'm acquainted with many truly good people, and I don't want my cultivation to be for purely selfish purposes. I hope I can resolutely unleash my fists and unsheath my sword and be justified in doing so whenever I come across matters of injustice in the future. I hope principles will be just that, not things that are dragged out when they're useful and thrown away when they're not. I hope even the weakest people dare to feel angry and dare to speak up, while even the strongest people are willing to respect others." Chan Ping'an paused for a moment before saying slowly, "I also hope all of the Chan Ping'ans growing up in the Clay Vase Alleys don't need to worry about so many things and are able to become genuinely good people." "Then let me ask you one final question," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said. "Do you understand your heart now? Just what kind of person is Clay Vase Alley's Chan Ping'an?" Chan Ping'an shook his head and replied, "I don't seem to have an answer." The old spiritual master smiled and asked, "Then do you want to keep thinking? If you keep thinking, when will this end?" This was the same question as before. Things were going around in circles, just like how the old spiritual master had walked around the perimeter of Paddling Island and returned to the same spot. However, one shouldn't underestimate this loop. The Taoist sect championed the notion of returning to natural simplicity. This was the pursuit of truth. Chan Ping'an held his hands inside his opposite sleeves and dazedly looked into the distance. After remaining silent for a long time, he smiled faintly and said something that wasn't an answer, but could also be viewed as an answer. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded after hearing this, not feeling like the young man was answering his question in a perfunctory manner. Chan Ping'an was a very clever person, so for him to deceive other people would be far too easy. It was deceiving himself that would be difficult. And thus, the old spiritual master couldn't help but sigh with slight emotion in his mind, thinking that the scholarly sage's skills in recruiting disciples were just as impressive as his own. "Do you have any thoughts about your third bonded item?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked. "Yes," Chan Ping'an replied with a nod. "Do you need my help?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked. "I do," Chan Ping'an answered with a smile. "Easy done," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said with a nod. Their exchange was crisp and direct, without a single wasted word. The old spiritual master patted Chan Ping'an's shoulder and said, "Go on, you can catch up with Feng now. I'll stay here to enjoy the scenery for a while longer." Chan Ping'an bade farewell and took his leave. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon remained standing in the same spot. He heaved a faint sigh. He recalled the answer that Chan Ping'an had given just then. "I've contended with myself for a long time, and I would rather be myself." Zhang Shanfeng stood up and closed the oil paper umbrella when he saw Chan Ping'an walking over, and he also walked toward Chan Ping'an before walking backward and asking in concern, "Are you okay?" Chan Ping'an shook his head and replied, "Yes, but also no. Say something that I can understand." Zhang Shanfeng exclaimed in frustration. "Then I'm okay," Chan Ping'an said with a faint smile. "For real?" Zhang Shanfeng asked. Chan Ping'an nodded and reassured. "Even more real than immortal coins." Zhang Shanfeng felt a headache after hearing this, and he grumbled, "This water dragon sect is so unkind. charging 1 lesser heat coin just to enter the Dragon Palace small world. I currently have a debt of more than 2,000 grain rain coins, Chen Ping'an chuckled. Zhang Shanfeng counted on his fingers, and just as Chen Ping'an told him to stop, he had already blurted out in shock. More than 2 million snowflake coins? Chen Ping'an reached up and rubbed his face. When he earned money, he was very fond of converting grain rain coins into snowflake coins. When he owed money, on the other hand, he truly wasn't fond of making this conversion at all. Chen Ping'an, there are some matters that even friends can't help with, and one can only rely on themselves to think these matters through, Zhang Shanfeng suddenly said. During his first trip outside the mountains to vanquish demons and eliminate fiends, the young external heavenly master from Mount Longhu had almost failed to endure the challenges and hardships, and it was because of this that he had gritted his teeth and directly traveled to the eastern treasured Vile continent, where he became acquainted with Chen Ping'an and Su Yuanxia. Only then was the knot in his heart slowly untied, and he had even comprehended a very mediocre fist technique. Chen Ping'an nodded lightly in understanding. Examining the depths of one's heart was most heart-wrenchingly painful. Chen Ping'an's current mental state was naturally nowhere near as relaxed as he let on. Zhang Shanfeng retrieved a porcelain bottle from his bag and said, "This bottle of water elixir is a gift from one of my master's friends at the Middle-earth Divine Continent's Mirage Lake. My master said I needed to return the favor after receiving the Heavenly Master Seal and the true martial sword from you." Chen Ping'an faltered for a moment, but he wasn't hesitant or excessively polite as he accepted the bottle of water elixir. Not only was it cool to the touch, but it even elicited a slight reaction from his water palace. He couldn't help but ask in curiosity, was this a gift from the water god of the Middle-earth Divine Continent's Mirage Lake? The Lake Lord of Verdant Bamboo Lake had gifted Chen Ping'an water elixir before, and sometime before that, he had also seen Lu Chongruan's secret collection of elixirs and alchemical pills in the water residence. However, these pills and elixirs were nothing compared to the bottle of water elixir from Mirage Lake. The immortal book from Stalactite Mountain made mention of Mirage Lake, describing it as a large lake in the Middle-earth Divine Continent. This water elixir wasn't refined from the bonded water fortune of Mirage Lake's Lake Lord. Was it? Zhang Shanfeng nodded and replied, "Yes, this is water elixir from Mirage Lake, but Master said that its grade isn't overly high. Master said that his relationships with the various water deities in the world are only so he's not able to obtain the highest grade water elixir." Chen Ping'an didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. The so-called highest grade in Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's description would genuinely be the highest grade in the entire majestic world. Equally, a so-called grade that wasn't overly high would definitely be very high already. Mirage Lake was extremely renowned in the Middle-earth Divine Continent, with an upper 5-tier deity overseeing the vast body of water. The water residence of the Lake Lord was the hugely famous Mianqi Palace, and it was said that the subjugation treasure stored in the palace was the largest Dragon King basket in the world. There were many ancient tales and legendary stories relating to Mirage Lake, with one pertaining to an unnamed Taoist priest who had been drifting around the lake on a boat under the bright moon. A flood dragon had dived into Mirage Lake to flee from a heavenly tribulation, eventually jumping into the Taoist priest's sleeve to escape from the thunderous lightning that was blotting out heaven and earth. The Taoist priest had casually dispersed the heavenly tribulation with a wave of his hand, helping the flood dragon escape from calamity. It was based on this legend that future generations had composed the beautiful line, "No place to hide from the falling lightning, seeking safety in a gentleman's sleeve." 1. Chen Ping'an held the hefty bottle of water elixir and turned around, saying in a soft voice, "You have a good master, Zhang Shanfeng." Zhang Shanfeng chuckled in reply, "I knew that ages ago. The old spiritual master has a good disciple," Chen Ping'an said with a smile. Zhang Shanfeng shook his head and replied, "There are many disciples like me at Ground Lying Peak." "I say there aren't a lot," Chen Ping'an retorted. Zhang Shanfeng smiled widely and remarked, "Stop speaking the nonsensical truth." Chen Ping'an wrapped his arm around the young Taoist priest's shoulders, and Zhang Shanfeng lowered his head and bent over slightly as he attempted to do the same and wrap his arm around Chen Ping'an's shoulders. They were playfully messing around. Chen Ping'an led Zhang Shanfeng into his room in the residence. Zhang Shanfeng saw the green hiking pole and sword immortal, which was hanging on the wall, and he chuckled as he said, "You're truly the same as always." Qian Ping'an carried a chair over for his friend, with the two of them sitting down opposite each other. Zhang Shanfeng started to recount his and his master's experiences in the Middle-earth Divine Continent and the Southern World Continent, and in the end he mentioned Lu Xianyang, who was currently studying at the Pure Confucian Chan clan. Qian Ping'an quietly listened to Zhang Shanfeng's recollection, with his mind tranquil and its ripples gradually subsiding. Zhang Shanfeng then started to talk about his return journey, but at some point in time, he suddenly discovered that the young man sitting opposite him had surprisingly fallen asleep while listening to his story. He felt slightly helpless, and he carefully stood up and quietly left the room, gently closing the door behind him before squatting under the eaves, with his mind becoming adrift. The world was a very strange place. There were some people who only focused on what other people had, never stopping to think why these people possess what they did. His master had described this as missing the forest for the trees, saying that the even stranger thing about the world was that thinking in such a manner wouldn't necessarily be all bad. Zhang Shanfeng had always felt like he didn't fit in with this world at all, a feeling that had little to do with his cultivation base. Only when he was slowly cultivating at ground-lying peak, traveling with Qian Ping'an and Su Yuanxia, or all by himself and facing the silent mountains and waters far away from the bustling cities, where he wouldn't make mistakes and harm others, and where heaven and earth wouldn't harm him, would Zhang Shanfeng feel slightly better. With this in mind, he had asked his master whether there was something seriously wrong with his Tao heart. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had responded that everything was okay, even saying that the Confucian sect was engaging in so-called addition, attempting to cultivate oneself, regulate the family, govern the nation and bring peace to the world. If one managed to succeed in all four areas, then one could be honored in the scholarly temples. On the other hand, the Taoist sect was engaging in so-called subtraction, attempting to draw clear boundaries and explicitly disassociate oneself with various matters, blurring the line between self and matters, and eventually reaching a space of tranquility. The Buddhist sect involved changing from the self-deliverance of Hinayana to the act of providing enlightenment of Mahayana, shifting from gradual enlightenment to instant enlightenment. It wasn't the wind moving but the heart moving, and there were the three studies of morality, concentration, and wisdom. In reality, these were all processes of addition and subtraction. It appeared on the surface that the three teachings were vastly different, with their paths leading in completely different directions, but at its core, cultivation was essentially a process of people walking along these paths. In this sense, the three teachings were still similar to each other. Zhang Shanfeng squatted on the steps and glanced back at the closed door. His master was right. Each person was like a small world, and after closing the door, outsiders wouldn't be able to see the true scenery inside. It was at this moment that Qian Ping'an quietly called Zhang Shanfeng's name from inside the room. "I'm here. I'm right outside," Zhang Shanfeng hurriedly replied. Only after hearing this did Qian Ping'an say in a slightly exhausted voice, "Then I'll sleep for a while longer. I didn't notice it before, but I'm actually feeling a little tired." "Sleep well," Zhang Shanfeng replied. Zhang Shanfeng placed his hands inside his opposite sleeves, gently rocking back and forth as he squatted on the steps with a smile on his face. Die. Some children outside the mountains were extremely clever from a very young age. However, it wouldn't be strange regardless of whether they eventually became cultivators in the mountains or not. What was truly strange was being able to host two completely different teachings, with one's mind continuing to fight, yet being unable to decide a victor no matter what. In Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's eyes, this was a case of true cultivation and true tempering of the mind. When it came to one's pure and connate disposition, what was difficult was how to nurture and maintain it. When it came to one's postnatal sincerity, what was difficult was being able to find it. Those who were sincere could display utmost sincerity and earnestness, allowing them to move others. Upon achieving paramount sincerity, one would glow as bright as the sun and shine as radiant as the moon. His disciple Zhang Shanfeng and his disciple's friend Qian Ping'an had two different dispositions. As such, they required two different types of techniques to nurture their dispositions. In reality, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had a slight bone to pick with the scholarly sage and Qi Jingchun. Since they had acknowledged Qian Ping'an as their disciple and junior brother, respectively, why couldn't they put in some more effort into guiding him? Why did they allow Qian Ping'an to wander around by himself? Were they truly not afraid of him dying just like that? Were they not afraid of him venturing down stray paths? Or perhaps directly letting go of everything and becoming a monk? Or truly thinking things through and becoming a Taoist priest? In fact, this was something that even spiritual master Fire Dragon wasn't able to understand. Why hadn't the scholarly sage chosen to take Chen Ping'an along with him, teaching him through both words and actions? Even though Qi Jingchen was destined to die, he could have clearly done more to guide Chen Ping'an with his knowledge and capabilities. Yet why hadn't he done so? They were truly very relaxed and open-minded. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon felt like he was already open-minded enough. Yet compared to those two scholars, he still had much room for improvement. A surprised expression suddenly appeared on Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's face, and he scanned his surroundings as if he had come across something else that he didn't understand. However, the old spiritual master thought for a moment before deciding to let the matter slide. At the bottom of the lake between White Armor Island and Greybeard Island, a horse-drawn carriage was stopped in the water, with water official Li Yuan and the Southern Fragrance Water Palace's Lady Shenlin standing next to each other. This person is actually acquainted with Spiritual Master Fire Dragon? Shenlin exclaimed in astonishment. Aren't I acquainted with that old man as well? Li Yuan asked with a cold chuckle. Shenlin smiled and thought to herself, of course you're acquainted with him. And Spiritual Master Fire Dragon even used a water element immortal technique to suppress you at the bottom of the Plenty River for more than 1 month. Even though everyone in the northern complete reed continent staunchly believed that ground-lying peak Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was the most masterful and peerless fire element cultivator in the world, only very few people were aware that the old spiritual master was also exceptionally skilled at water element immortal techniques. Shenlin was preoccupied with many thoughts. Li Yuan's skin suddenly started to crawl at this moment. As it turned out, that old spiritual master was standing at the shore, smiling with squinted eyes as he waved his hand at the horse-drawn carriage. Li Yuan was just about to transform into golden light and scatter away, but he immediately abandoned this thought because Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had already arrived at the horse-drawn carriage, standing on the back of a majestic snow-white horse. Shenlin immediately bowed in respect and greeted. The Southern Fragrance Water Palace's Shenlin pays her respects to Spiritual Master Fire Dragon. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was relatively polite toward the water goddess, and he said with a smile, "All things are natural, and following the path of nature will allow everything to naturally fall into place." The heart of the water goddess, whose face was like a shattered celadonware, shuddered, and she said in a quivering voice, "Thank you for your guidance, Spiritual Master." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and didn't say anything, after which he glanced at Li Yuan and remarked in amusement, "Oh? Isn't this esteemed water official Li Yuan from the middle shrine of the Plenty River? I'm running into the esteemed water official everywhere, and this is truly fate that can't be pushed away." Li Yuan put on a stern expression and played deaf and mute. "What's this? You think you're amazing just because your Tao power is higher? You can't get physical and hit me just because you don't like the look of me, can you?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and proposed. "Water official Li, you have nothing better to do anyway, so how about the two of us have a chat?" "I'm busy. I'm very busy," Li Yuan replied with a baffled expression. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon flicked his sleeve and replied, "Oh, I can make some time first," Li Yuan immediately said. The old Taoist priest and the young man left the carriage and walked through the lake. Shenlin activated a mystical ability and steered the carriage back to the summer palace. After Shenlin left, Li Yuan immediately put on an obsequious smile and said, "Old brother Fire Dragon, why didn't you give me a heads up that you were coming to the Dragon Palace Small World? Are you treating me like an outsider because you're looking down on my dire state?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon replied with a nod. I am indeed looking down on you, water official Li." Li Yuan felt like there was no way to continue this conversation. He was the mighty water official of the Plenty River, yet right now, he was filled with discomfort as he was seemingly imprisoned underwater. They fell silent for a long time, traveling a great distance underwater with their figures as graceful as mist and smoke. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon finally said, "The Water Dragon sect has treated you quite well after establishing their sect, so why are you still acting so haughty and insisting on occupying the head chair in the ancestral hall?" Why are you providing the sect leaders with a constant reminder that the ancestral hall is your territory, and that they're only temporary occupants? Has water gotten into your brain? Since you dare to act in such an arrogant and domineering manner, are you truly regarding yourself as the ruler of the martial world? Li Yuan appeared listless as he replied, one can always trump up a charge against someone else. I'll admit to whatever you accuse me of, old spiritual master. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon chuckled coldly and said, no matter how deep the relationship is, it won't be able to stand such flagrant abuse from you. The Dragon Palace small world enjoys gentle winds and calm rain, with few major problems needing to be addressed. Does this have anything to do with you? Is this not thanks to Shenlin's effort and hard work? Why did you stand by idly when that sword immortal stole the water fortune paramount treasure of the small world back then? He was able to trick the busy Shenlin and the Southern Fragrance Water Palace, but was he truly able to trick you, someone who's idling around all the time? Li Yuan pursed his lips before quipping, the Water Dragon sect didn't say anything either. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was naturally aware of the many complicated relationships, with the matter not being a clear-cut case of good and evil. However, one could ultimately look at the approximate outcomes of all matters, with these outcomes often being the catalyst for more karmic matters in the future. This was like the ripples on a lake. Observing an entire lake would be very difficult, but could a person call themselves a cultivator if they couldn't even observe the rise and fall of the ripples? If it weren't for my relationship with that person, do you think I would be willing to waste my breath on you? The old spiritual master asked in a solemn voice. Li Yuan heaved a sigh, no longer playing dumb as he said in a solemn and helpless voice, I've observed the rise and fall of the Water Dragon sect for many years, as well as the increase and decrease in their incense offerings. A lot of my hope has died and I feel like everything is quite uninteresting now. Sun Jia, the current sect leader, is a decent person, but what difference will that make? It's not like I haven't thought about letting the Water Dragon sect perform standard refinement on the middle shrine of the Plenty River. However, the two people whom I had high hopes for both failed to become the sect leader, with one of them essentially being killed by the Water Dragon sect and me. The Water Dragon sect is subject to my whims and has been repulsed by me year after year, but this is simply of their own doing. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon was seemingly expressing great pity for Li Yuan's misfortune, yet he was also expressing deep annoyance at his lack of fight. He exclaimed, stubborn brat! Drawing the eyes of a dragon, even rocks nodding in approval, playing an instrument to a cow, and like chickens speaking with ducks, which saying in the mountains wasn't filled with knowledge. 1. At the end of the day, it was most difficult for deities and immortals to converse with each other. You should try to be a decent person, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon thus said. Li Yuan's embarrassment turned into anger as he exclaimed, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon, stop picking on me just because your Dao power is higher. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon placed a palm on the water official's head and chuckled in response. And what are you going to do if I pick on you? Li Yuan wanted to cry, but no tears were forthcoming. His expression was scrunched up as he conceded, then I'll obey old Spiritual Master and try to be a decent person. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon launched a gentle palm strike, sending Li Yuan crashing into a huge crater at the bottom of the lake. He chuckled and scolded, brat who remembers beatings and doesn't remember kindness. Li Yuan lay at the bottom of the huge crater and played dead. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon gracefully landed beside the crater and said with a serious expression, stop regarding yourself as a high and mighty deity. What if I fall short on both sides? Won't I feel even more upset at that time? Li Yuan opened his eyes and asked. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon shook his head and remarked, how arrogant. Sure enough, you're a difficult one to teach. Li Yuan wrapped his hands behind his head and said with a numb expression, I'm nothing but a frog at the bottom of the well, unable to see the sky even when I raise my head. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon had already left quietly at some unknown time. Li Yuan sighed in grief. He had suffered another palm strike for no reason at all. Die. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon slowly walked into the residence on Paddling Island. Chen Ping'an was already awake, and he was standing in the courtyard and watching Zhang Shanfeng practice fist techniques. He was just about to pay his respects when he saw Spiritual Master Fire Dragon, but the old Spiritual Master waved a hand and said, There's no need to tire yourself with this, having the thought is already enough. I'm able to at least perceive this. Let's go inside and take a look at your third bonded item. If everything is okay, then it's best to refine the bonded item as soon as possible. There's no issue with thinking about more things when cultivating in the mountains, but this doesn't imply that we must necessarily do things slowly. In any case, taking things slowly doesn't mean literally taking each step at a slow and leisurely pace. Qian Pingan, you need to carefully make a distinction between the two. Qian Pingan silently committed this to memory. Zhang Shanfeng stopped practicing fist techniques, walking inside the building with his master and Qian Pingan. Qian Pingan carefully retrieved the shattered wooden deity statue fragments from his minimization treasure. This was a wooden deity statue that had been enshrined in a Taoist temple atop the mountains. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon flicked his sleeve, causing an auric ripple to appear in the room. This ripple appeared like a table, and it was dark green and smooth like a mirror. Qian Pingan retrieved the 36 gray bricks from the floor of the Taoist temple. There were also 122 green glazed roof tiles. Additionally, there was the large bundle of bamboo branches and the large pile of bamboo leaves he had harvested from that green bamboo plant. These are the treasures you've accumulated after visiting many small worlds and blessed lands? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked. Qian Pingan shook his head and replied, "These were all from the one place." However, he was too embarrassed to say that he had essentially picked them up from the ground. "Are you a bandit?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked with a strange expression. Qian Pingan was just about to retrieve a few more treasures from the mountains, but he could only stop after hearing this. There was still the effeminate round fan he had purchased from Taoist Master Sun, the pair of Dragon King baskets, the ancient mirror that Huang Shi had gifted him, the Taoist abstinence plaque, the jade bracelet inscribed with a palindrome poem, and the tree gall pot. Qian Pingan had initially planned to show all of these treasures to the old spiritual master, letting him appraise their value. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon glanced at the large pile of wood fragments again, not in any hurry to reveal its secrets. He pointed at the gray bricks and commented, "Their toughness is no inferior to the dragon-slaying platforms coveted by sword cultivators in the world, and this is because they've been nurtured by the true intent of Tao power for many years. The water fortune essence contained inside them is only a surface-level appearance, so one will truly be wasting divine treasures if they absorb the water fortune essence but abandon the bricks." Qian Pingan glanced at Zhang Shanfeng, who was standing beside them. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and said, "Why would you give them away? Leave them for yourself." The number 36 corresponds to the 36 heavenly generals, proof of affinity with karmic Tao opportunity. Being short even one brick will ruin the opportunity. The old spiritual master pointed at one of Qian Pingan's critical acupoints and said, "The human body is a small world and the character gang is composed from 4 and proper, implying the center of the 4 directions. To the 36 heavenly generals symbolize the essence of yin and yang and represent the genuine earth element. One intangible and one tangible, both are profound principles of the Taoist sect. Didn't you refine 5-colored soil as one of your bonded items of the 5 elements? This is perfect, and you can perform standard refinement on the 36 gray bricks to act as the roots of that mountain in your heart. At the same time, you can also use them to nurture your thoughts as a cultivator, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. However, refining these bricks will exhaust a huge amount of spiritual energy. Indeed, crafting mountain roots is no easy task, so I'll teach you a mantra afterward. Dragon veins are also separated into mountain veins and water veins, and your current refinement method isn't very suitable for crafting mountain roots." Spiritual Master Fire Dragon picked up a green glazed roof tile and asked with a smile, "Do you know how many immortal coins this colored glazed roof tile will be worth if you sell it to the correct person?" Qian Pingan shook his head in response. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon raised a hand and waved it around. 10 lesser heat coins? Qian Pingan guessed in an uncertain voice. 10 lesser heat coins? Is that worthy of me waving my hand around? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked in amusement. 10 grain rain coins. Grain rain coins, Zhang Shanfeng suggested quietly. And that's only if I sell it to White Emperor City's colored glazed pagoda in the Middle Earth Divine Continent? Qian Pingan asked. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded in response. Speaking with clever people save both time and effort. To ordinary cultivators from immortal forces, one colored glazed roof tile will sell for at most 1 grain rain coin. To those who fail to recognize the value of this treasure, however, they'll be unwilling to part with even a few lesser heat coins. This is especially the case since these colored glazed roof tiles only become remarkable after many of them are gathered together. Otherwise, a small number of them will be nothing more than a useless gimmick. Hearing this, Qian Pingyan was extremely grateful that he hadn't sold his treasures for a bargain price. Otherwise, wouldn't his Tao heart become unstable again after learning this truth? Spiritual Master Fire Dragon picked up a bamboo branch and chuckled. This comes from the descendant of one of the 10 ancestral bamboos in the Bamboo Sea small world, and it can be regarded as a direct son or direct daughter. The quality of this bamboo is like stone, allowing it to be crafted and giving it strength and toughness. The bamboo is upright, and its nodes advance bravely, signifying a mind as open as a valley. Many of these descriptions pertaining to bamboo talk about virtue and moral integrity. What virtue do you think was represented by the bamboo plant that you came across? Why were you destined to coincidentally come across it? I don't know, Qian Pingyan replied with a shake of his head. That's correct, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said with a smile. In reality, this was a sign of many affirmations following the many refutations after Qian Pingyan's examination of his heart. If cultivators only sought the stillness of their hearts when they examined their hearts and pursued truth, then apart from cultivators of the Taoist sect, would the remaining cultivators from the 100 schools of thought still need to cultivate? What would they be cultivating? In reality, it wasn't important which bamboo plant Qian Pingyan had come across, nor did it matter which virtue was embodied by the bamboo plant. Truth be told, Qian Pingyan didn't know why he was correct. Standing beside them, Zhang Shanfeng felt like Qian Pingyan was correct because his master had said so. Otherwise, it wouldn't be very good if his master insisted on always making things difficult for Qian Pingyan. Shanfeng, you can continue to practice your fist technique in the courtyard, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon suddenly said. Zhang Shanfeng nodded in response, not asking any questions as he walked outside. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon made a grabbing motion, causing the wood fragments on the table to either fly around or hover in the air, resulting in many light collisions between them. They swayed gently, eventually coming together to form a wooden deity statue of a middle-aged Taoist priest. This was like a mountain god or a river god reconstructing their gold statue. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon heaved a faint sigh as he looked at the so-called middle-aged Taoist priest. He then pushed aside his remembrance, with his expression becoming serious as he asked in a solemn voice, Qian Pingyan, where did you obtain this deity statue from? Qian Pingyan briefly recounted his experiences during that treasure-hunting trip. He skipped over many matters pertaining to Taoist Master Sun in the ruins of the immortal abode. However, Qian Pingyan underestimated Spiritual Master Fire Dragon's knowledge and Tao power. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon focused his gaze on the wooden deity statue and revealed slowly. The Taoist second disciple was wearing a Taoist robe when he used an immortal sword to kill this person. One of this person's direct disciples is called Song Maolu, with this disciple becoming even more impressive than his master. Song Maolu is a 1 in 1,000 year prodigy in the heavenly world, and he relied on his own power to bring together almost 60% of the Taoist forces outside White Jade capital. Can you imagine what it will be like if someone in the majestic world is able to rival half of the Confucian sect? Qian Pingyan was unable to imagine this. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon continued to reveal the secrets of the heavenly world. After reaching such a lofty cultivation base, and especially with virtue accompanying him, casually uttering the names of sages was no longer a taboo. Thus, the old spiritual master continued. As for this deity statue, it's not an ordinary statue that's enshrined in the many large and small Taoist temples of the same branch. This deity statue is the most important statue of this Taoist priest, with the exception of his original deity statue. You can think of this as something akin to a cultivator's own soul after it leaves their body. Moreover, this deity statue is crafted and refined using wood from the ancestral peach tree planted in the Mystery Capital Temple. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon smiled and further revealed, and the temple master of the Mystery Capital Temple, that is, the senior brother of the Taoist priest represented by this wooden deity statue, has always been one of the top 10 cultivators in the heavenly world. Over there, he's known as Eternal Fifth. It can be said that this temple master is the pillar responsible for holding up the sword immortal branch of the Taoist sect. After saying this, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked, "Can you confirm that there won't be any hidden dangers?" "Yes, I can," Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. "Good one. You're going to make a killing," Spiritual Master Fire Dragon said with a chuckle. If an ordinary junior had dared to speak so boldly, Spiritual Master Fire Dragon would have genuinely persuaded them to think carefully before acting. However, this junior was Chen Ping'an, so there was no need for such a warning. In any case, since Taoist Master Sun, who had already ascended and returned to the heavenly world's mystery capital temple, was willing to leave this item behind, this was already an act of acknowledgement and approval of Chen Ping'an. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon paused for a moment and glanced at Chen Ping'an, appearing to finally understand something at this moment. He was able to vaguely guess Qi Jingquan's good intentions. However, he wasn't sure whether or not his guess was correct. "Have you prepared the natural treasures necessary for ordinary refinement of earth element bonded items?" Spiritual Master Fire Dragon asked directly. "Yes," Chen Ping'an replied with a nod. Spiritual Master Fire Dragon nodded and said, "Then that's already enough. There's no need to gild the lily." Chen Ping'an breathed a sigh of relief. After all, there was only a single chance this time, unlike when Cui Dongshan had prepared 3 portions of 5-colored soil. He had initially planned to seek reliability and stability, only performing refinement of the bonded item when he had all 3 of opportune time, geographical advantage, and popular support. This was why he had still hesitated about refining the bonded item, even after entering the Dragon Palace small world.